Ce soir, je te suis jusqu'à l'infini. Ce soir, je te suis
Can you hear the sound?
Yeah.
jusqu'à l'infini. Ce soir, je te suis 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 jusqu'à l'infini. Ce soir, je te suis
Welcome to Seminar 12 of Greats in Thought. Derrida versus Foucault. Heavyweight bout. Round 1. It is now time for me to clear up a few misunderstandings. I am not what I am, just as Zen monks have lived as sweepers, and king's jesters have curled up like dogs to go to sleep. I, too, know how to chase bones and arrange the autumn leaves. But I am not a sweeper, and I will not stay in my kennel like a dog. I have many attributes, many modes, many manifestations. I can raid a picnic like a pack of seagulls. I can swing between the centuries like a monkey in the trees. But I am not those monkeys or those seagulls. I am more than what I do. I am in excess of what I read. What is this Foucault to me except a maggoty cheese, festering with flavor? I do not eat like a maggot. I am the splendor of decay that makes those maggots bloom like glossy pearls. No, no. This Derrida is not the rock on which I found myself. I deride all Derridas. I fool all Foucaults. I laugh at them as only breezes know how to laugh. I am the wind that blows through the forests of their works, scattering the pollen. I sweep leaves into the paths of playing children. Do not confuse my steps with the way I go. I move, but the way stays still. There, in the fetid opalescence, where new thoughts cream into the night, I lick them up like a cat. Derrida, Foucault, these are the names of storms that pass across my breasts. Good little storms that bring fecundity to their master. This evening, I preside over a bout between madness and the cogito. I will be umpiring a match between Foucault's my body, this paper, this fire, and Derrida's cogito, and the history of madness. But all you viewers at home, beware. the referee has also brought along a pair of boxing gloves. Greats in thought. Read, riff, rapscalionate. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Greats in thought.
All right, boys.
Well, there we go.
Quite the evocation from Patrick there, who, as usual, we cannot hear.
Oh, you can't hear me?
Yeah, no, I can hear you now.
Oh, God.
Can you hear me now? It's like a fucking Peter Kay joke. You know? Can you hear me now? I'm on the bus. Hey!
Can
Well,
you
you know,
hear
we
me?
are-
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a lot of noise?
No?
Huh?
No,
No,
all
no,
right,
no.
good. I have a
Yeah,
massive
yeah.
3D printer in the background. Like, zzz.
Oh, okay. Well, it's just noise for you then.
yeah. All good. All good. Then.
No, it's all good. So, I mean, this is one of the richest and most dense confrontations in the history of philosophy. I think, precisely because of its almost obscene level of, transparency. Like these are two heavyweights going after one another. And I think we'll have to have a second, we'll have to have the decider title match. Who comes out on top? Foucault or Derrida. But I wanted to go back to the last seminar, and I wanted to go back to it because, there is this sense of that Derrida himself comes to at the end of his. I mean, if the critique that Bataille level that André Breton, with which we began the last seminar, was virulent and brutal, the critique that Derrida levels at Foucault, despite his ablutions and apologia, to characterize Foucault's work as a demonic project of madness, to kind of like directly accuse his interlocutor of being mad. Well, in a certain sense, that is a kind of discourse with which we are unfortunately familiar with today. And so it's kind of a important historical note in terms of the timing and the emergence of these three kind of papers, So Madness or the Absence of an Oeuvre, My Body, This Paper, This Fire, and Response to Derrida. They all emerge in 1972. It's like 9 or 10 years after Derrida made his critique. And you can see very clearly, if you think back to what we've looked at in Le Pouvoir psychiatrique, you can see very clearly the way in which Foucault is kind of post this confrontation with Derrida, taking up these notions and these critiques and trying to, in the lectures that we have already considered, repurpose, refigure, transform. And there are so many things to say, but what I wanted to do was to kind of save, because it's part of my own critique of Foucault, in fact, this sense of kind of like malevolence, this sense of being sovereign, being domineering, being this, as he will later go on to say, Septimius Severus figure, this emperor of the philosophical establishment. And given that these passages emerge in between Derrida's critique and Foucault's response, I thought it was a good moment to try and reintroduce something that I've been advocating for throughout this kind of season in Greats in Thought, which is that Foucault is very kind of like mischievous, as Hattrick might put it, impish. I love this word. It's kind of infiltrated and infected my vocabulary now. I find myself so many times in the day describing friends of mine as impish. It's such a beautiful kind of rich word. And so I wanted to restore that quality or character of playfulness, of mischief, to Foucault, and just by reading a few passages, so that directly relate to the critique of Derrida, that are deeply implicated in this kind of tete-a-tete with Derrida, and that show in one way or another something essential about the thesis that I've articulated previously, that Derrida in this specifically in cogito, in his kind of reductiveness. So for example, the notion of like oeuvre, well, oeuvre, it refers to like a life of work. It refers to the kind of like grand arc of one's work, the progress, the development, the movement, the kind of stops, the caesuras, the aporias, the resolution. Whereas Derrida kind of reduces that to mere travail. And travail and oeuvre are just very, very different things. And the cynicism, deviousness, reductiveness, the kind of chicanery of Derrida that to me is almost like a prefigurement of the walking corpse that is contemporary academia. I think a kind of easy way to overturn them, and also to restore to Foucault, not to rob the comments that you guys have made about there is a certain kind of like malevolence, a certain kind of like sovereign imposition that his work takes, but just rather to reinstate this side of Foucault, this side of playfulness, this side of mischief, and to reinstate it precisely after he has made this response to Derrida. So I'll begin with the preface to the 1972 edition of the History of Madness. I think it's one of the greatest kind of like meta commentaries on philosophy and the role of the text that has ever been written. And it is also, to me, not just kind of brilliant, prescient, kind of like so astute, so precise, so, it slices like the sharpest of knives. But at the same time, it has so much movement and space and air. So, preface to the 1972 edition of the History of Madness. I really ought to write a new preface for this book, which is old already. But the idea I find rather unattractive. For whatever I tried to do, I would always end up trying to justify it for what it was and reinsert it insofar as such a thing might be possible in what's going on today. Perhaps that would be possible, perhaps not. I might do it with varying degrees of success, but it would not be an honest course of action. And above all, that wouldn't be in keeping with what should be, regarding a book, the preserve of the person who wrote it. A book is produced. It is a minuscule event, an object that fits into the hand. But at that moment, it takes its place in an incessant game of repetitions, for its doubles, both near and far, start to multiply. Each reading gives for it an instance an impalpable, unique body. Fragments of it pass into circulation and are passed off as the real thing, purporting to contain the book in its entirety. And the book itself sometimes ends up taking refuge in such summaries. Commentaries double the text still further, creating even more discourses where it is claimed the book is itself at last, avowing all that it refused to say, delivering itself from all which it so loudly pretended to be. A reissue in another place and in another time is yet another of these doubles, something which is neither totally an illusion nor totally an identical object. The temptation is great for the person who wrote the book to lay down the law regarding these flickering simulacra and prescribe a form. Oh dear. Jakob. This PDF he sent me. It cuts off the it cuts off.
No crescendo.
I can continue reading it if you want. I have it here.
yeah. So where did I finish? Fragments of it pass into circulation, and are passed off as the real thing.
Wait, you said, well, are you asking?
Yeah. I've got it. I can continue reading, but why don't you
The
go?
temptation is great for the person.
Yep.
That's where we were.
Hmm.
Well, okay. Well, I read then or what? What are we doing?
You read.
Yeah, all
Yalla,
right.
habibi.
Yalla,
Cholo,
okay.
cholo.
Okay. The temptation is great for the person who wrote the book to lay down the law regarding these flickering simulacra and prescribe a form for them, to give them a ballast of an identity, imposing a unique mark that will give them all a certain constant value. I am the author. Look at my face or my profile. This is what all these doubled figures that are going to circulate under my name should look like. Those who stray from it are worthless, and it is from their degree of resemblance that you should measure the value of the others. I am the name, the law, the soul, the secret, and the balance in which these doubles should be weighed. So speaks the preface, the first act in which the monarchy of the author is established, a declaration of tyranny. My intention should be your percept. You must bend your reading, your analysis, your criticism to what I was trying to do, and take note of my modesty. When I speak of the limits of my enterprise, I mean to set a boundary for your freedom. And if I claim that I feel I was not up to the task, it is because I don't want to leave you the privilege of substituting my book with the fantasy of a different one. Close it, but more beautiful, close to it, but more beautiful than the book itself. I am the monarch of the things that I have said, and I keep an eminent sovereignty over them, that of my intention and the meaning that I wish to give to them. Read the whole thing?
Yeah.
Yeah. My desire is that the book, at least for the person who wrote it, should be nothing other than the sentences of which it is made. That it should not be doubled by that first simulacrum of itself, which is a preface, whose intention is to lay down the law for all the simulacra which are to be formed in the future on its basis. My desire is that this object event, almost imperceptible among many other things, should recopy, fragment, repeat, simulate, and replicate itself, and finally disappear without the person who happened to produce it ever being able to claim the right to be its master and impose what he wished to say, or say what he wanted it to be. In short, my desire is that a book should not create of its own accord that status of text to which teaching and criticism will all too probably reduce it, but that it should have the easy confidence to present itself as discourse, as both battle and weapon, strategy and shock, struggle and trophy or wound, conjecture and vestige, strange meeting and repeatable scene. For these reasons, when I was asked to write a new preface for this book, which is being reissued, I could only answer that the previous one should be removed. That would be the honest course. We should not try to justify the old book, nor reinsert it into the present. The series of events to which it belongs, and which are its true law, are far from being over. As for novelty, we should not pretend to discover in it a secret reserve or a richness that initially escaped detection. Its only novelty is the thing that have been said about it, and the events in which it has been caught up. I will add only two texts, one already published, where I expand on the phrase I ventured rather blindly, madness or the absence of an earth. The other unpublished in France, where I try to address a remarkable criticism by Derrida. But you have just written a preface. At least it's short. It is short. Michel Foucault. There we go.
Well, you have just written a preface. At least it's short. Wow. I mean, so And in a kind of like a contradiction into what Derrida is trying to do with his intervention in respect of who he sees to be his master, Foucault. I'd like to read just the very first paragraph from the Order of Discourse, which was Michel Foucault's inaugural lecture at the Collège de France, and it was given on the 2nd of December, 1970. Now, I won't go into the whole thing, but essentially he goes into a kind of like paean, an ecstatic praise of a great teacher and reader of Hegel, who taught Foucault, called Jean Hippolyte. But this is how, and to provide a kind of, to provide a kind of like preface or angular foreshadowing, such that we can grasp at la différence between Derrida's, what to me, illusory deviousness, his kind of academic manners, his self-effacing petty bourgeois mode of annihilating himself and any possibility of accusation before he says what he really wants to say. I'll just briefly read the Order of Discourse. I wish I could have slipped surreptitiously into this discourse which I must present today, and into the ones I shall have to give here, perhaps for many years to come. I should have preferred to be enveloped by speech and carried away well beyond all possible beginnings, rather than have to begin it myself. I should have preferred to become aware that a nameless voice was already speaking long before me, so that I should only have needed to join in, to continue the sentence it had started and lodge myself, without really being noticed, in its interstices, as if it had signalled to me by pausing for an instant in suspense. Thus, there would be no beginning, and instead of being the one from whom discourse proceeded, I should be at the mercy of its chance unfolding, a slender gap, the point of its possible disappearance. I should have liked there to be a voice behind me which had begun to speak a very long time before, doubling in advance everything I'm going to say. A voice which would say, you must go on, I can't go on, you must go on, so I'll go on. You must say words as long as there are any, until you find me, until they say me, strange pain, strange sin, you must go on. Perhaps it's done already. Perhaps they have said me already. Perhaps they have carried me to the threshold of my story, before the door that opens on my story, that would surprise me if it opens. I think a good many people have a similar desire to be freed from the obligation to begin, a similar desire to be on the other side of discourse from the outset, without having to consider from the outside what might be strange, frightening, and perhaps maleficent about it. To this very common wish, the institution's reply is ironic, since it solemnizes beginnings, surrounds them with a circle of attention and silence, and imposes ritualized forms on them, as if to make them more easily recognizable from a distance. Desire says, I should not like to have to enter this risky order of discourse. I should not like to be involved in its peremptoriness and decisiveness. I should like it to be all around me, like a calm, deep transparence, infinitely open, where others would fit in with my expectations, and from which truths would emerge one by one. I should only have to let myself be carried within it and by it, like a happy wreck. The institution replies, you should not be afraid of beginnings. We are all here in order to show that discourse belongs to the order of laws, that we have long been looking after appearances, that a place has been made ready for it, a place which honours but disarms, and that if discourse may sometimes have some power, nevertheless it is from us and us alone that it gets it. But perhaps this institution and this desire are nothing but two contrary replies to the same anxiety. Anxiety about what discourse is in its material reality as a thing pronounced or written. Anxiety about this transitory existence, which admittedly is destined to be effaced, but according to a timescale which is not ours. Anxiety at feeling beneath this activity, despite its greyness and ordinariness, powers and dangers that are hard to imagine. Anxiety at suspecting the struggles, victories, injuries, dominations, and enslavements through so many words, even though long usage has worn away their roughness. What then is so perilous in the fact that people speak and that their discourse proliferates to infinity? Where is the danger in that? And so finally, a short paragraph from the Archaeology of Knowledge, published in the same year, 1970. Here, Foucault adopts the position or function of his critics. Aren't you sure of what you're saying? Are you going to change again? Shift your position according to the questions that are put to you and say that the objections are not really directed at the place from which you are speaking. Are you going to declare, yet again, that you have never been what you have been reproached with being? Are you already preparing the way out that will enable you in your next book to spring up somewhere else and declare as you're doing now? No, 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 no. I'm not there where you think I am, lying in wait for me. I'm over here, laughing at you. And so I thought, as a prefatory to this, to the beginning of this discussion about Foucault's kind of virulent confrontation with Derrida, that those three texts, written precisely in the moment of silence being precisely what Derrida picks up so forcefully and virulently in his critique. I thought that they were kind of like interesting prefatory remarks, and at the same time, I think they do not salvage, not save, but restore to Foucault a certain mischief, a certain playfulness, a certain openness and tentativeness that perhaps at the end of the last seminar we move towards foreclosure.
Yeah, all right. I also see like pervading that all those speeches, pretty much all of them, maybe a little bit less the first one, a weird kind of like, I don't know how to put it, but it's almost like some sort of metaphysical grief, some sense of being miscast as himself, someone that like sort of weighed down on some sort of weird burden that he doesn't know how to carry or name or what to do with, So there's this, I can understand this longing in myself. I don't know how far I want to go down this kind of like this little stream, but this idea of joining in a conversation, not wanting to begin a conversation all by yourself, that seems to be what is the thing? What is the threat of just beginning something all by yourself? What is a threat, like we've talked about before, of kind of like irredeemable solipsism, of only talking to yourself, So in a weird way, like we can kind of feed this into some of the stuff that we're going to be looking at today. There's obviously one of the big concepts you've already introduced, this idea that madness is the absence of an herb. Okay. Now I think that Derrida also wants to repurpose and reassign a place to this statement that's not quite, equating the herb with travail, but something else, and a similar kind of move. But we'll come back to that. But he says something really interesting right near the end of this critique of Foucault, where he says that he mentions who does he mention? Not Aquinas, one of these like famous religious thinkers, and he says that basically reason is the speech that overhears itself, that kind of receives itself, that listens to itself. Okay. So what Derrida says is that madness is precisely not hearing your own words, okay? Being incapable of receiving your own speech. So this is all about his like equivocation, his uncertainty about how to how to talk about the relationship between madness and language, between madness and speech. And then he finds this way of talking about it. That it's not that madness doesn't speak. Its silence is not the silence of speechlessness. Its silence is the silence of kind of obliviousness, you know, of an inattentiveness to its own words, of its own words being ungraspable by itself. So going back to this idea of, I think this is kind of true. You think about like Wittgenstein, like, well, just think about chatter in the streets. You listen to someone talking, you're saying, look, if they really understood what they were saying, they would be ashamed of themselves. Okay. The only thing that allows them to go on being chatterboxes is that they're somehow incapable of hearing their own words. Yeah, it could be like a clumsy comment towards their kids, you know, or it could be a clumsy comment about the current political situation. And what the sense that you get is not that someone has a kind of like mad way of, or a cruel way of disciplining their children, or that they have kind of nefarious or dodgy political views. Your overarching feeling is that they're not even thinking about how they're talking to their children. And they're absolutely not thinking about these political views. They just function as kind of like, you know, like a doorway through which the kind of draft of discourse, you know, enters and departs. They just function as these kind of conduits for gossip, you know. And that's the state of obliviousness. That's the state of thoughtlessness. And that's the kind of state of madness that Derrida kind of tries to articulate at the end. Anyway, so going back to this idea of coming late to the conversation, you know, being able to join a conversation that's already begun. Well, that then becomes the kind of utopia or paradise for the philosopher, because then he gets to receive the speech of another person. Okay, he gets to prove to the other person, the person who's spoken first, that he or she is not mad. He gets to welcome the speech of the other person, to host it, you know, to be its kind of like sponsor and advocate. Whereas the one who goes first always has to plunge himself into the jeopardy of madness, always has to expose himself to the risk of madness, to the risk of being utterly unintelligible, utterly unreceivable, yeah, to meeting with kind of, you know, inhospitable interlocutors. And I'm reminded, you know, that kind of like brilliant beginning to David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest. Do you remember that, where he goes for an interview? Either it's a tennis academy or it's like a kind of classy secondary school, you know, and he's sitting down in the interview, and what you don't know this at the beginning, but the kind of narrative is like really cleverly and mischievously constructed, so that whenever like they ask him a question, he always gives this kind of refined and sophisticated answer, but their reactions become increasingly kind of like incongruous and weird with respect to these answers. And what you realize is that they're not understanding anything he's saying. You know, they're experiencing everything he's saying as gobbledygook, as gibberish, as a kind of blabber. And eventually they kind of like restrain him, and he goes into this kind of like epileptic fit and stuff, you know. And I often feel like I'm in this situation, you know. I'm talking to someone and they talk back, and I'm like, I basically as good as said nothing to this person, you know. Either they, at the worst, they just, no, at the best, they kind of like it just goes over their head, and then there's no danger because you haven't been heard, you know. But the absolute worst, it's like Gombrowicz says about the insults that are the most uncomfortable, you know, are the insults that don't fit, just as the shoes that are most uncomfortable are the shoes that don't fit, you know. So that when someone receives my words and completely misunderstands them, is this moment of exasperation, you know, that does border on a kind of madness, you know, because if you're exasperated in that way once, it's okay because that person's just an idiot. But if everyone receives you in this kind of inadequate way, misprices your words, you know, misinterprets them, then you're the mad one, because you haven't yet found, you know, how should I put it, the person who's going to continue your conversation. You haven't yet found the person who's going to represent the second phase of the conversation that you've begun.
It's just to say something there about that opening to Infinite Jest. I mean, you know, one of the things that it's Hal, right? The kind of semi-protagonist of Infinite Jest. I mean, you know, it's so kind of like elliptical and evasive in terms of story, you know, all sorts of things. But you know, so Hal, you know, he says, you know, I'm the kind of guy who gets in a taxi and says, to the library, and step on it. You know? And then what's interesting is that, yes, you know, he is giving these kind of like really eloquent answers, but what I think is beautifully rendered in that passage at the beginning of Infinite Jest is the bifurcation. right?
Yeah.
And that bifurcation is like kind of like marked and punctuated by the point at which the committee begin to say like, oh, like, have you just like prepared this? Have you like copied this? Have you, is this real? And then steadily, as he kind of like, perseveres, he kind of, keeps going with these even more kind of, like elaborate, eccentric kind of, bizarre, as you say, like illegible explanations. There's this moment of bifurcation and then this beautiful dramatic turn where all of a sudden the kind of perspective in some way switches, so the kind of like, like bland and banal way in which we think about literature, all of these are completely eviscerated by this passage, because there's no sense of like perspective, author, intention, or it's very much like what I was talking to you about pathos. It's very much about the kind of audience, but manifested like in the text. So this, actually, to go against myself, this is like one instance where pathos is very directly manifested in the text, and it manifests because like at first it seems as if it's like a first person account, like from Hal, and then there's this moment when it kind of flips, and the unintelligibility of Hal, comes into like, he turns into this like creature making noises and grunts.
Yeah.
Who has to be like, like carried by his arms and legs. Like,
Yeah, and there's no way, you're right, there's no way of fitting them together in the same cosmology, those two moments. You get like a shift. That's what you mean by this. It's not really a shift of perspective at all, because there's no way he could have been the same, both of those people, So maybe what I'd say is there's almost like, in a like kind of Heideggerian sense, a shift of mood. You're kind of tricked into sharing this mood of like hyper confidence, almost like, a sort of gallantry of intellect, a sense of superiority, poise, eloquence. Because I actually remember another bit, there's a double bifurcation, because you get him, every time they speak, he corrects their bad grammar, and he substitutes in like a word that they should have used instead of the word that they did use, So he's not even really paying attention to their speech either. And you get lulled into sharing his sense of like superiority, and magnificence over them. And then there's this sudden shift of mood where this weird kind of like tinnitus and, screen fidgets kick in, like a kind of mood of anguish that just then seizes you. And it's like the change is kind of cataclysmic. There's a huge cascade and collapse. And the text suddenly like, becomes precipitous and rushes towards its end, and you're just like shit, like the ground is taken from underneath you, Yeah. No, it is a fucking great opening, that. Yeah. But like, it links to this stuff as well, because the whole point is like, solipsism is not some kind of like, thing that can be remedied through therapy. It's not some defect of the mind, or it's fundamentally a kind of like political circumstance, a circumstance in which you find yourself and you have to try and get out of it. And there's no obvious way to get out of the kind of labyrinth of solipsism. Your attempts could just like, kind of entangle you further in it, bury you deeper, make you even more unreceivable. But yeah, maybe we should like try and kick off with this, exploring this little nexus, this link then between madness and language. Because if, as you say, Luke, Foucault is being accused of being mad, and also being radically misunderstood by Derrida, then he finds himself in that position, position of de facto solipsism, trying to wriggle his way out again.
I would like to go into the text or the two. For me, I focused on Derrida's the cogito and then my border, this paper, this fire. But I don't know where you want to go in. But I would like to kind of just jump into the text and the.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's begin with the beginning of Derrida's text, okay? Because that's the one that Foucault takes up, at the beginning of his text.
Right.
Everything gets a bit more interesting later, but there are some like amusing maneuvers at this stage that definitely accord with like Luke's reading of Derrida as this kind of like, because in France, maybe just as an intro, there is this, Foucault definitely has this feeling of pervasive kind of anti-philosophy, yeah, because the French, they kind of, at least at this epoch, kind of worship the philosopher in the way that we worship the scientist now. The public intellectual was always a philosopher, okay, and he was always someone that was a kind of acrobat of abstract thought. So he'd like come down from his mountain or his castle or whatever it is, from the sort of like, the infinite distance of thought, and he'd drop a few like adages and aphorisms, and these things would dazzle people and they'd pick them up and take them home, But around about, like, you can see in the 80s and 90s, there begins to be this pervasive skepticism. It's first embodied with people like Bourdieu and in Foucault, who deliberately take on the philosopher as this kind of idol, because the philosopher is kind of like Mandarin, as high priest, because you have to remember that the philosopher is also someone who has a status as functionary. There is, like, I just give you a really like simple bureaucratic example, that all teachers are functionaries in France. I don't know if that's the same in Sweden or Denmark, but they're all functionaries. Means they have to pass a state test to become teachers. Now the philosopher, there's a special role. Basically, there's this thing called l'agrégation, okay? And that's like, you can get the CAPES, that's the teacher qualification. You can get l'agrégation, that's like to be a superior kind of teacher. Yeah. And then you've got the teacher of philosophy, who only teaches at lycée level. All right. So the philosopher is like a third category. So if you're a philosopher agrégé, that means you only teach like a few hours a week to kids at lycée. So that's from like 17 to 19 or 16 to 19. So that means that you've basically got a state funding, and your only responsibility is to, sprinkle a little bit of your wisdom and reading into the minds of, 16 to 19-year-olds. Okay, so you do have this position that's protected almost by kind of right, by kind of rite of passage, by sort of ritual of initiation. And I think at a certain epoch, people start to see a complicity between a certain kind of knowledge or wisdom that's convenient for the state, and then these philosophers who profess themselves to be radical or maverick or world overturning, and Foucault definitely fits into that dynamic. So, like, just to give you an example again, like, there's this really great program that everyone should watch called Apostrophe. Like, I don't think it still goes on now, but it was really big in like the 80s and 90s. And when you get like Baudrillard comes on this program, the attitude towards him is kind of contempt, skepticism, distrust, constant kind of mockery of his words, as if, oh, he's just one of these fucking philosopher characters who hides himself in enigma and mysticism, and tries to elude any basic or two questions that are too confrontational, too forward. So I do think that that's in the background here. Derrida as high priest, and then Foucault as one of these skeptics, and one who actually kind of, like with Bourdieu, makes this skepticism towards the philosopher really widespread.
So just to sorry, Jacob, before you go, to add like a kind of anecdotal experiential side to that, when I was living in France, and it's like, what do you do? And I always say the same thing, I'm a writer, je suis écrivain. And this happened like on a number of occasions with a number of different people, and they were like, oh, it's a good job you're not a philosopher, So there's what moved from the kind of like almost like divine-like status of Les Sâtres, which Foucault is like very conscious in wanting to undermine this. So there's a scene in A Bout de Souffle, Breathless by Godard, and it's a philosopher at the airport, and it's with Jean Seberg, and she's like, quelle est votre grande ambition dans ta vie? Like, what is your greatest ambition in life? And he kind of ignores her, and the camera pans to these other journalists that are asking him these big questions about like love, life, cosmology, and then he's accepting all these questions and kind of replying like he's being questioned like a god. And then finally she asks a different question, and he returns an answer which in English is it's like she asks, do women have a place in modern society? And he says yes, if they are very pretty and wear a cute dress and sunglasses. She kind of bites her pen, and then at the end, she gets to ask her her question that she began with as a journalist for a junior journalist for the New York Tribune. And he just says, he takes off his sunglasses. He's like, devenir immortel, et puis mourir. And so this kind of figure of of the grand philosopher, and it still continues in France, but because it's been like hijacked by the right wing, by people like BHL, Bernard
Bernard Henri Lévy, yeah,
these kind of like face like false kind of like
well, he's a very weird.
sophist.
He's actually like
So
the
now,
end of
like
this movement.
Amongst the French left, which is much larger than in most countries. If you say you're a philosopher rather than like a writer or an anthropologist or anything else, there's this kind of immediate like attachment to this notion of sovereignty, dominion, direction, to restriction, to defining like the parameters of defining like the parameters of existing, the meaning of sense, the order, like Foucault speaks of in his preface, I am the rule, the law, the order in which these doubles must be weighed. But it's an interesting like slight diversion into French culture, but Jakob, take it up. Let's go to the text.
Yalla. I thought, for me at least, I've seen I'm sure there's more, but I've seen Derrida's kind of argument. I think Foucault addresses one of them. And now I'm talking about My Body, This Paper, This Fire, right? So Foucault starts with a kind of quote there of Derrida, but we can also then just go into Derrida's text. And it's this whole kind of argument about dreaming and the madman and madness, right? Dream versus madness, and how Descartes kind of maneuvers in that in the first meditation. So Foucault quotes, it's a long quote, but I will read just a part of it. So this is Derrida. In any case, Descartes' concern here is not with determining the concept of madness, but with using the contemporary notion of eccentricity, extravagance, to juridical and methodological ends, in order to ask questions of principle that only concern the truth of ideas. What must be retained here is that from this point of view, the sleeper or the dreamer is madder than the madman, or at least that in relationship with the problem of knowledge that interests Descartes here, the dreamer is further from true perception than the madman. It is in the case of sleep, not of eccentricity, that the absolute totality of ideas derived from the senses becomes suspect and stripped of objective value, in the words of M. Guiraud. The hypothesis of eccentricity was therefore not a good example, a revelatory example. It was not a good instrument of doubt. And then he takes kind of two facets of this and takes A and B examples. And this argument seems very central to me. I mean, Foucault spends, to me, almost the whole text.
80%, yeah.
Yeah. Like fucking with this argument and kind of proving him, or trying to disprove Derrida, which I think, in a kind of short summary, is kind of that. And this is also a quote from Foucault, where Foucault kind of concludes that madness is excluded by the subject who doubts in order that he may qualify himself as a doubting subject. And then, of course, that is expanded. But that, as I see it, is kind of Foucault's fundamental kind of critique here of Derrida's reading, which I guess is also in the original text. In the History of Madness, he already, to me at least, makes this argument, even though I had to reread or like read that passage. I haven't read the History of Madness. It also feels a bit kind of uncharted territory, this thing for me. Not having read the Meditations or History of Madness fully. But maybe, can we start there? I mean, I want to hear what you have to say about that. Because it's, to me, this is one of Derrida's kind of attacks, and then there is another attack which is about this mad audacity of the Cartesian cogito. And then, of course, then that's his kind of philosophical source, as I see it. But then he also has this kind of methodological critique, which Foucault completely doesn't address, as I see it. He neither in the reply to Derrida, which is some kind of postscript a bit earlier text than My Body, This Paper, This Fire, but neither in My Body, This Paper, This Fire, Foucault actually, I feel, addresses this idea that, Derrida accuses him of kind of trying to write this history of madness itself and blah, 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 and kind of to write outside the history of reason. And it seems to me, I'm curious to hear also maybe later on what you think about that, because to me, it seems like Foucault, he doesn't address this critique in Derrida's Cogito and the History of Madness. But let's start with the first one, the madmen and the dreamers.
Yeah. Well, let me just make a tiny quick point, and then I'll give it over to Luke. I was saying something to Luke beforehand, like how this, in many ways, Foucault's text seems to me a kind of blatant piece of sophistry. There is something kind of like, deliberately devious about it. And I'm reminded of that. He wants to win the argument, basically. And I'm reminded of that stuff that he says about in the medieval court. That it's not about amassing evidence in order to prove that so and so is the guilty party, that he's actually culpable in accordance with what will become like scientific rigorous standards, for forensic evidence and reliable witnesses and so on. The point is basically to kind of intimidate and pulverize the opponent until he gives in, and thereby, in and through his weakness, he kind of like, he attests to the strength and power of the law. Yeah. Now, I don't want to go down too hard now, but I actually think I want to defend it in a way. I want to defend this movement. I want to say that Foucault actually takes moments, because he kind of, in a weird way, this is the weird thing about Foucault, he does celebrate the medieval court in and through its like acceptance of agon, of the rivalry between, in some way, he likes that. He likes that it's kind of open and honest about the fact that it's a rivalry between two parties, and that, in some way there allows power to become visible, because power is not hiding behind rationalizations. Power is not hiding behind the kind of, chicanery of protocol, and this sort of like facade of like scientific scrutiny. Anyway, this is like Foucault's idea. So I don't think that he thinks that there's anything wrong with trying to assert your authority and power, but it does move the argument away from truth in some respect, and then you have to get the sense of, well, what is Foucault fighting for then? If he's willing to use these tactics of sophistry and like strategy and so on. Because what is the sophistry here? What is the strategy? Well, he deliberately picks the point at which Derrida's argument is weakest, most vulnerable, and where he does seem to be playing lots of like, Derrida himself seems to be getting himself entangled in a desire to like play tricks on us, to downplay something that's, actually of immense importance. So what is the disavowal that Derrida performs? Well, it's this idea that the objection from madness, this idea that, okay, well, can I doubt that my hand is actually my own hand? Can I doubt that this fire is actually kind of warming me with heat? The idea that would make him a madman himself is something voiced not by Descartes, but by some other interlocutor, whose voice randomly appears in the text at this moment. He's the layman. He's the kind of the innocent, naive party. Foucault calls him the peasant somewhere, as if trying to like politicize this voice in some way. And I do think this is a weird, dodgy move. Like, I don't understand why Derrida makes it, except from, and it goes with this other dodgy move as well, that somehow the dreaming subject is madder than the mad person. Okay, and that seems to me just balmy. Like, I don't understand. Like, why should we believe that when? I'm going to try and make a really technical point here, but the only reason madness is functioning in two different senses there, both as the thing that qualifies or describes the madman, he has madness, yeah, and secondly as a kind of intensifier that gives us a sense of the dangerousness of dreaming. Okay, so if dreaming is to be dangerous, it's only dangerous insofar as it's mad, because dreaming is madder than madness. Okay, and yet Derrida at the same time wants to dismiss madness as a kind of like a false form of danger, a form of danger that's not actually very threatening or doesn't jeopardize the philosopher, or whatever it is. And later on, he'll do the same kind of weird move when he'll say that the cogito is madder than madness. Okay, there's a form of reason that's madder than madness. Again, how does that make any sense? Because if the cogito is mad, then it's only mad in and through its resemblance to madness. It can't be madder than madness itself. Yeah, do you know what I'm saying? I feel like the dream scenario is only kind of breathtaking, only makes us feel that the ground has been taken from underneath us because it resembles madness. Madness is still the truly terrifying thing. Madness is still the truly disorienting thing. Yeah. So yeah, I think we can. I want to hear what Luke has to say about that.
Well, I was just going to respond directly to this kind of like methodological, point that Derrida makes in respect to Foucault. Now, maybe I should have kind of like preface this with the kind of devious, duplicitous chicanery that he engages in beforehand. In the way in which he begins by saying that I don't want this to be taken as an attack on my older master, and then at the end says that you are mad, that your project is one of madness, and your analysis is demonic. And there to me is something deeply cynical about that, something deeply devious. It's very common in academia. It's a kind of like
what does he say about this the demonic shit? I missed that part, I must say.
Yeah, I can't.
It's towards the end of let me go to the notes. It's towards the end of the.
But 1 second, because I feel like that in order to understand the idea of him calling Foucault demonic and mad, we have to trawl through the other stuff about the cogito being a form of madness, not being inhospitable.
Sure. I just wanted to.
I don't know how to reply to that without going through the whole of the thing. So maybe if we just stay with Foucault's critique of that opening move of Derrida's, the idea that.
Let me just bring in Derrida here. I have 3 exclamation marks next to this. So he's talking about the analysis of Foucault. This is why it is not human in the sense of anthropological faculty, but is rather metaphysical and demonic. It first awakens itself in its war with the demon, the evil genius of non-meaning, by pitting itself against the sovereignty of the evil genius, and by repositioning him through the reduction of natural man within itself. Foucault's project is both mad and demonic. And then he goes on to talk about like this kind of like structural totalitarianism but I actually think that maybe like a good way to respond would be to go back to the start, but it would be to lay out some of these really kind of devious and cynical maneuvers that Derrida make. So the first one is this way where he says that, oh, my dialogue might be taken incorrectly as a challenge, as the disciple that knows that he is already challenged by the master's voice that precedes his own, the mirror or order of his own discourse. The disciple must break the glass better than mirror reflection, the infinite speculation of the master, and start to speak. And so it's this. To me, it's very cynical to present one's argument in this way. To kind of, I don't know, it's something that I've lifted from Patrick in previous seminars. It's like he's already got his escape routes, He already has these means by which he can make these virulent accusations against Foucault that in my mind have got no grounds or basis. But he's already in the kind of like first preamble to this conversation. He's already looking for the exit. He's already looking for the way out. And then something that came through all the time was his constant privileging of philosophy and of the stature and status of the philosopher, which of course is something that Foucault wanted to undermine. And like, they didn't have the time to kind of like go through and systematize and find all of these moments where I was like, he's really privileging. So for example, the way that he privileges logos. Now, in Foucault's response, he precisely distinguishes one small confusion of logos between logic or order and speech, right? So Foucault gives it two senses, whereas in the analysis of Derrida, logos assumes this kind of like imperious and total sovereignty. You know, it is not something that's in any way confused. Whereas in and you know, Patrick would be a much better person to speak of this because you know he's engaged with the ancient texts and with the notion of logos in a much more thorough way than I have. But at least like my kind of limited understanding is that you know the logos is something that's deeply conflicted, deeply situational, that takes you know kind of like various forms in various situations. That is kind of you know that's more curial, that's movable. That yes, it can in a certain sense mean speech. Yes, it can in a certain sense mean order. But then it can also be you know deployed as a kind of like linguistic kung fu, like we've talked before. You know when it's translated in ancient Greek, if you read like the Harvard Loeb translations, what's nice is they have the ancient Greek to the left, so you can see whether or not they translate, for example, reason as logos, and reason is not logos. But Derrida makes that kind of coterminosity like really strict all the way through. And then the to speak to his deviousness, I mean, I'm trying to find my notes, but I can just tell you. So there's a moment where, and this is like the methodological question, and he's saying about, well, what is a notion, for example? But he doesn't challenge the scientific concept. And then he doesn't kind of think about the interplay between, okay, so why does the scientific concept have this leverage, this power, this you know sense of like kind of sovereign inevitability, and then why does notion have like a lesser force? You know, why is notion soft and concept hard? So in Derrida's very questioning of Foucault's use of the word notion, you can see that there is a certain obsession with power. You can see that there is a certain obsession or a desire within Derrida to assume this kind of, you know, status of the philosophical god of the likes of Sartre, because he constantly affirms the primacy of like philosophical discourse in various ways. And I remember he states it like, because I was going through and I kept seeing this thing all the time. And then Patrick, you know, both of us have talked a lot about like Cavell and, you know, Cavell's struggle to introduce like Emerson as like, you know, a worthy figure of, you know, philosophical discourse and reflection. And then we kind of massively blow that up into, you know, into pop culture, into media, into music videos, into sound, into all sorts of things. You know, why are these not legitimate things of philosophical reflection? Like with you know, Apocalypse Now. You know, I immediately position Apocalypse Now as a work of philosophy, which I think it is. You know, it isn't just a kind of object of philosophical reflection. It is in and of itself a work of philosophy. Yeah, Derrida, in some way, he wants to like sequester, contain. You know, he wants to make this little throne in which he is the philosopher king. You know, something that we will come back to later. And I'm just trying to find the exact. I know it's towards the end of my notes, and it's where it's where he says. So after all of these allusions, after all of this privileging of the philosophical subject, after all of these privilegings of philosophy as this, you know, kind of realm of domination, sovereignty, of this realm that kind of, you know, reigns above other things. And we must also appreciate that, you know, the moment at which Derrida is speaking, and I think, you know, we should also come back to this notion of, you know, truth as event, the kind of truth of the particular moment, the preface, you know, also, you know, Foucault's essay on Was ist Aufklärung, because fundamentally Foucault's repositioning of Descartes, or Descartes, you know, I always say Descartes, I know it should be Descartes. Maybe I should be fucking English and be like, Descartes. But, you know, like fundamentally, his repositioning is that we should not engage with, you know, Descartes at the level of significance of his argument, or, you know, we should understand Descartes as the moment in which philosophy becomes accessible to everyone in and through a kind of basic reflection upon senses, you know, upon something immediate. And he does a very similar thing with Kant in his essay on Was ist Aufklärung, what is enlightenment. Rather than kind of engaging with like the significance of Kant's text vis-a-vis its philosophy, its argument, he says no, Kant's text is an event in the history of philosophy where the present moment comes into question, where the present moment becomes a legitimate object of kind of like philosophical reflection. And I think Foucault is always trying to get away from this sense of the philosopher as God. Philosopher as depicted in Breathless, philosopher as Sartre was. This person to whom everyone would direct their queries and concerns, and he was almost treated like the Pope would be to a Catholic devotee. And the moment in which Derrida says this very explicitly after alluding to this in kind of various like parabolic or elliptical ways throughout the text, is where he says that the philosopher is the speaking subject par excellence. And so it's this privileging of philosophy constantly. And so I think that the kind of like the methodological qualms that Derrida has with Foucault, well, they don't have any contact or link because they're both involved in completely distinct enterprises. Foucault, in a sense, is trying to spread the philosophical, let's call it the philosophical function. It's like a, I don't know, it's a hand concept without thinking too much about it. He wants to spread this kind of philosophical function across the surface of the socius, right? To kind of like provoke, to inspire people in a way, to kind of, to think, to challenge, to ask, what does this present moment mean? What does this present moment mean by me being a part of this present moment? And to what extent does me being a part of this present moment make this moment the present moment? And given those reflections on the present moment, myself, and the relationship between the two, how might I intervene in this present moment to affect some kind of transformation? That and then he goes back to the old philosophical themes of dispelling illusions, of lending people clarity. The thing that's kind of parodied and mocked in the Clouds by Aristophanes. Where you have the parody is that you have the father and he has his son and he has all these problems and these debts, and the son's accumulating all these debts. He doesn't know how to pay for them, but he's heard of this place called the Thinkery where the philosophers live. And word on the street is that at the Thinkery, Socrates can teach you how to make the weaker argument defeat the stronger. Ah, perfect. Says the father. He's like, I can get my son to go and learn from Socrates at the Thinkery how to make the weaker argument defeat the stronger. And therefore, I can kind of, I can get out of all of my debts. I can free myself of all of my debts. Anyway, that's like a kind of like a rabbit hole to go into. But there's this constant kind of like privileging of this notion of the philosopher, and that's precisely what Foucault is trying to dismantle with his kind of like historicization. I mean, Foucault like absolutely refused the title of philosopher. They created a title for him, the Collège de France, which was the professor of the history of systems of ideas. And then later on in his life, he said, they were like, are you a post-structuralist? You are this, you are that, you do that. And he laughs. And he's like, I'd have thought they'd have found some box to put me in by now. But, if you were to ask me a title with which I am most comfortable, I'm a historian. So he's constantly resisting and rejecting, this thing that Derrida is absolutely trying to affirm. And I think what's curious is the way in which Derrida tries to affirm this is just so, to me, like, it's just so full of trickery and elision and sleights of hand. And like, so for example, when he talks about, to go back, when he talks about the notion, and he says, well, what is a notion? But yet he doesn't say, what is a scientific concept? So it's like all the things that affirm kind of like Derrida's position, Derrida's lust for power, Derrida's want to be the philosophical figure, precisely which Foucault rejects. He questioned only that which challenges his thesis, and he kind of affirms without question only that which supports it.
Mm. I sympathise with everything you're saying. I just think like I want to rescue something from what Derrida says. Okay. But I think the best way to do it is just to be like, I will come back to the stuff that you just said, Luke, because in broadly, I'm like, you know, it chimes with what I think as well. But so you've got this idea. What are the grounds under which like Foucault actually objects to Derrida's reading of Descartes? Now, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head when you said that there's something like Foucault tries to see it as an event in the history of thought. Okay. And there's loads that goes on within the Derridian text about this concept history. Okay. Now, for Derrida, precisely as this kind of magisterial philosopher, as this guru of thought, you know, what he wants to, and in a way, he wants to be that, like kind of openly, almost like in his writing, like a Heidegger. You know, he's a descendant of Heidegger. He thinks that the philosophers are almost have the status of kind of like, you know, certain kinds of guru figures in the ancient world, sibyls, you know. And eventually their wisdom kind of trickles down into the populace. But when the philosopher thinks his thoughts, he thinks them in this kind of enigmatic way that's impossible to decipher and understand. And he can only give it on in this particular form. So what he wants to argue is that there's an element in Descartes' thinking that escapes his historical situation. Okay, that's one thing. Now you can think of it in a really banal sense, like the idea that, oh, the great work transcends its time, you know. Or like you said before, like every era has to rewrite the Iliad, you know, or the other people say that, you know, the great work is kind of exhaustible, so it's constantly open to rereading, you know, reinterpretation, you know, to be joy ridden by somebody else, received by somebody else. But I think then after that, I think Foucault that wouldn't be much of an attack on Foucault. Foucault would agree with this. Yeah. So it's about what are the moments in which Derrida isolates the way in which Descartes escapes history. Well, it's in his reading of the Cogito. And for him, there's a moment where, in fact, I'm going to work my way up to this. All right. So for Foucault says that there's a massive difference between the way in which Derrida treats dreams on the one hand, you know, and sensory error, and the way in which he treats madness on the other hand. Okay. Now with dreams, what they are is they're kind of appreciated as a philosophical puzzle. Okay, so is there any way, is there any truth, or a philosophical like test basically, is there any truth that can survive, that would survive, you know, if it turned out that I was in fact dreaming? Okay, and Descartes says, well, look, my hands wouldn't belong to me, you know, the things that I can see over the other side of the road, they might not be there, so those truths would all kind of disintegrate and collapse into nothing. But certain truths do survive this kind of like sieve test, you know, they're like mathematical truths. So we have a certain kind of truth which has a different status, a different kind of solidity. Yeah. But then this is where it gets interesting. He says that his relationship to madness is completely different. It doesn't take the form of a philosophical test. It takes the form almost of a risk to which, you know, Descartes is troubled about exposing himself. Okay, so whilst the dream scenario puts him in a state of like calm, equipoise, you know, contemplativeness, the idea that he might be mad, having to live through his own madness, you know, having to test his reason against this plunge into madness, that provides him with a kind of anguish, and he resists it in advance. As soon as he feels the drawing near of madness, he dismisses madness. Okay, he expels madness, he banishes madness, because in some way, again, like for Foucault, the plunge into madness is too much of a risk. Okay, it could like tear up the psyche itself. You know, so what reason has to do, as soon as it founds itself as this style of thinking, it has to dismiss madness in advance. Yeah. Okay, so that's one thing. Secondly, and this is like really like another clever move that Foucault makes. He talks about, and this is what he keeps banging on, because there is this kind of, it's pedagogue against pedagogue as well. You know, Foucault doesn't have his hands clean here. You know, Foucault is like, oh well, you know, such a great reader as Derrida, to think that he's actually skipped over these important like lexical quirks, you know, and verbal abnormalities is just astonishing. You know, there must be some, you know, some serious force that's blinding him to things that he would usually recognize. And what are these things that Derrida has missed? Well, on the one hand, they are the idea that as soon as Descartes starts talking about madness, he employs a vocabulary of comparison and contrast. Okay, so madness is the other of reason. Madness is the counterpoint to reason. And this is really crucial for both Derrida and Foucault. I know that I'm not mad, because I'm able to think about madness, and I'm able to dismiss madness, I'm able to kind of like return from the possibility of madness back into the safe house, the comfort of reason again. So madness is always the counterpoint of reason. But dreams, they are always accompanied by the vocabulary of memory. Okay. So it's the idea that, I can go back to a point yesterday where I was dreaming, and I had this particular dream and so on and so forth, or I can go back to the point yesterday where I had this sudden sense that I was awake by this sudden experience of deja vu, like I was back in a dream again. So they're two very different kinds of experiment. One is an experiment that brings anguish because it relates to the other, being confronted with this kind of like foreign element, an element that deranges me, that robs me of myself. And the other one is an experience of kind of euphoric comfort because it links me up to past versions of myself, other moments. And also, as Luke was saying, the kind of ordinary man. Anyone can he actually addresses someone and says, any one of you readers now can go back to a moment where you thought you might be dreaming, but it turned out you were awake, or you thought you might be awake, but it turned out you were a dream. So there's a kind of a tone or mood of familiarity there. All right, then you got the second like big critique, which is again like a kind of scholarly critique, really, about Derrida's reading of a certain passage, where a peasant is supposed to be speaking. And basically, Foucault says, well, it couldn't be a peasant because look how precise the use of the Latin words are. Okay. And he goes back to this stuff on demens and amens and insanus, and he says, that insanus is a term of characterization, and demens and amens are disqualifying terms. Okay. So the reason why Descartes is terrified of being mad is because it would disqualify him as someone who could speak in a court, for example, and be taken as a reliable witness. It would disqualify him as someone who's capable of speaking wisdom and giving good counsel to a king. He would be robbed of certain rights protected by law and things like that. So basically, it would rob his words of authority. It would rob his words of gravitas if he were in fact mad. Now, the way in which the umbrella or the categories that Foucault then forms to be able to kind of ram home and insist upon this critique relate to like something fundamental, a big, huge difference between his thought and Derrida's thought. So he says that basically Derrida is one of these kind of textual spiders. He's the one who sees a text as a series of traces, a series of marks left over. And so fundamentally sees the job of the reader as one of scholarship and interpretation. Okay. Whereas Foucault fundamentally sees the text as a discursive practice. Okay. So it's something fundamentally to be taken up, worked upon or worked through by an individual who hopes to transform himself. He talks about this idea of to have his subjectivity modified. So Descartes' text is not about saying, okay, this is the voice of the peasant at this particular moment, and here is this is the point. This is what Descartes means, or this is the best way of interpreting this particular passage. But rather, now do what I've just said I'm doing. Now actually go back, sit down where you are, and carry out this experiment in doubt. Carry out this experiment in skepticism. Look at your hands. Can you get to the point of being freaked out by a sudden glimpse of their unreality? Can you be unhinged in that way as well? Can you be deranged and exasperated in that way? Okay, now the next stage. And this is what Foucault talks about. You go on to different stages. That can we recuperate that moment? Can you actually believe in that moment, or is there also another part of you that kind of rejects that moment of derangement, that non-belief? Whatever it is, and then the moment of madness would be like, can you actually survive this experience of thinking that you're mad? Or can you survive the experience of being tormented, hoodwinked, and tricked by the evil genius? They are practices to be undertaken. So Descartes has basically written a user's manual for how to become, you know, more thoughtful, clear-sighted, you know, and to have a sort of more, I don't know, basically ways of intensifying your experience of the world and your experience of your own subjectivity. Okay, not again a series of textual traces, a series of textual marks to be interpreted. Now, the only thing that I'd say in response to that is that there is a kind of, later on, a sense in which I don't know, Foucault fails to give a kind of, or fails to accept the possibility that Derrida might also be engaging, maybe unwittingly, you know, maybe only in moments of like poetic hyperbole, in a similar kind of discursive practice, you know, trying to encourage us to enter into the state of the cogito, that as he describes it, not as this, the moment where the cogito confronts madness, you know, as Derrida describes it. Okay, not in order to dismiss madness, but in order to say, and again, I don't know, like, I can't test the validity of this as a point about Descartes, but instead of seeing Descartes as someone who dismisses madness, you see Descartes who says, I can be mad and still affirm the cogito, you know, I am mad, but still thinking. Okay, so there is a kind of thinking that does not banish madness, that does not dismiss madness. Okay, and this, like, whether you agree with this or not, whatever, like, but let's just set it out. Like, this links to all the stuff. Like, he spends most of his time at the beginning going through a completely different critique of Foucault, where he picks up on a tiny remark that Foucault makes, where Foucault says that in ancient thought, logos had no other. Okay, so in classic thought, you know, in the classical age of reason, logos has an other. Okay, logos is reason and its other is madness. All right, but at a prior age, in ancient Greece, logos had no other. So what Derrida says is that, well, there must have been a point of bifurcation, of a split in logos. Okay, so what like would have made Foucault's project more like powerful and kind of scintillating was if he saw the classical age, or anyway some age, as the point at which logos bifurcates, as the point at which logos actually splits into that it splits into reason on the one hand and madness on the other hand. You know, I could go on and on, but just to give one example is when Foucault starts talking about hybris or hubris, okay, and particularly in the figures of Thrasymachus from the Republic, and what's the other guy called, Callicles or something like that, yeah. And these are two guys that enter into Platonic dialogues as kind of like, you know, these angry, ranting, resplendent outsiders who come up with astonishingly strong arguments, but their tone of voice is like vehement, you know, aggressive, confrontational, and violent. Okay, so what this moment, and obviously, like Foucault says, eventually this kind of like angry outburst, this you know, this outburst of hybris, is dealt with by Socrates. You know, Socrates is able to neutralize it or tame it in and through his dialectic, but nonetheless, it's given a place, it's accorded a place within Plato's text, within Plato's general architectonic, and it's not like completely exhausted by Socrates' remark. You know, so we see there that there is an epoch in the history of thought in which madness is given a place, given a space within the dialogue. Okay, so what Derrida is in some way trying to do is trying to say that Descartes is actually trying, in some part, to get back to that original logos. Okay, he is trying to almost like undo the split between reason and madness, and return to an earlier stage, which he calls gives the name the cogito, where reason itself can host, you know, the voice of madness, when reason itself can survive madness. Without like becoming, you know, unreason or mere rationality. Now, of course, that goes with, you know, Derrida's imperial desires to dominate the whole like domain of thought, because if that's true, that means he also controls madness. You know, he can get into these trance-like states, these euphoric states, where he doesn't only speak in the voice of reason, as Luke has already like parodied and satirized, like these moments where it's like, oh, what is really the meaning of a notion, which are kind of ridiculous, you know. They're almost like their own satire, their own parodies, you know. You can imagine Moliere, like several centuries before, writing the same lines for one of his kind of like out of touch and ludicrous pedagogues. But then so he wants the ability to be able to interpret, but he also wants the ability to be able to speak in the voice of madness. Okay. So he has control over almost like the two domains of reason. Now, part of me thinks, yeah, thinking can do that. Thinking can, you know, get itself into a trance-like euphoric state where it becomes a medium or conduit for a voice of madness or hybris or what Derrida calls the demonic hyperbole. Whether Derrida does that or not, I don't know, you know. The other thing, just to bring it back to history, is that actually that is also a secret way of eviscerating history, of getting rid of the importance of history, you know. And like, you know, I can't get into this, but for me, history includes all those things. Like, for example, if the text is a discursive practice, well, that reintroduces history. How? Well, it reintroduces history in the form of the people who are actually reading this text and carrying out the practice, you know. So history is reintroduced in the form of these embodied subjects who take on texts and try and see what can be done with them, you know. Oh, how can we use this concept as a tool, you know? How can we use this concept as a weapon? How can I use this concept as a way of enhancing, or, you know, myself, or improving myself, or whatever it is? That's also a way of reintroducing history. But, you know, so there is lots of weird, dodgy stuff mingled together here, but it is very rich. It's hard to contain, you know. It's hard to contain.
I mean, I have you know, so many things to say, and I was just looking kind of through my notes and motions and movements of Derrida, and I'll just kind of point out one of the most obvious, which is where he places these. He becomes a complete, you know, essentially my kind of reading of Derrida that I'm unable to get over. You know, where Patrick is very generous in his reading. Whereas I read Derrida and I'm like, mate, you're a fucking cunt. You know, Derrida, you're a cunt. And so I really struggle to take him at all seriously, because to me, his maneuvers and his rhetoric are so kind of, you know, they're so obscene and so grotesque and so lacking in any kind of, you know, like, he doesn't even do it in a stylish way. He doesn't even kind of conceal it. And so there's this moment where he says, I do not know to what extent Foucault would agree that the prerequisite for a response to such questions is, first of all, the internal and autonomous analysis of the philosophical discourse. And then, so basically, he's making these conditions of the acceptability and legibility of Foucault's work, right? Now, to Descartes, so on the one hand, he says of Foucault, so I'm going to make this virulent and violent critique. I'm going to call your analysis mad. I'm going to say that you are demonic, which, you know, notwithstanding the kind of like pathetic, obsequious, sycophantic, you know, where, and this is all the way through, you know, he says like, and I will limit my understanding to this, or even the way, and I think he's very conscious of being a cunt, you know. Like, this is the guy who would turn up to his lectures in, like, you know, like a Rolls Royce with a fucking model on his arm, stride down to the front, you know, and like, you know, have these kind of like fetid, fervid, you know, kind of like sycophants in a fever. Is like, you know, like, this guy knows exactly what he's doing. And there's a moment, there's a moment in his work that's very revealing of this. And he says that, oh, I will limit my analysis to this paragraph here. And then he goes on to make this kind of absolutely totalitarian diagnosis of another paragraph. And that he's constantly doing this thing where he's making a kind of like limitation, and then he's using that limitation. I mean, like, Derrida to me is like Benjamin Netanyahu manifested into philosophy, you know. He says, oh, you know, so I'm going to do this, like, we're going to do a limited targeted strike, and then, you know, they fucking blow everything up, and then it becomes genocide, regime change, ethnic cleansing, you know. This is kind of like Netanyahu to me is like the political equivalent a fucking Derrida, you know, like Derrida and Netanyahu would be great friends, you know, if they were like, especially if, you know, Derrida was in some way, you know, he could conjure up a Jewish history and wear that fucking rapacious Holocaust yellow thing on his, you know. I think you know, like he is like a neo-Nazi Netanyahu fantasy. But so the revelation to me of the kind of like sick cynicism of Derrida is here, right? He says, "I do not know to what extent Foucault," and then he goes to make all of these radical claims about Foucault. Then in the next paragraph, he says, in regards to Descartes, only a rigorous and internal analysis of his manifest intentions, of the manifest meaning of his philosophical discourse. So he sets these completely different conditions, right? And that to me is revelatory of his thirst, his lust for power. Because, you know, Descartes is this figure in the French philosophical tradition who has so much power. Why? Because he establishes, in a certain sense, scientific power. Right, he like anesthetizes and sterilizes sensory experience, and you know it will be. I think Descartes wrote. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Descartes was like 1500, 16th century, Kant 17th century.
Descartes is later than that. Descartes is like 17th century as well.
The meditations
Let me
are
just
probably
show it where it's
1641, I think.
But
Yeah.
you know
he's like late. He's after Shakespeare. You know?
He's providing the grounds for this, precisely this thing that Derrida doesn't bring into question. So he brings into question the notion, but he does not bring into question the scientific concept in the same sentence. You know, he's like, what is a philosophical notion? Yet at the same time giving, and it's just all of these devious maneuvers, and I just can't get over them. It's like, okay, so the fact that I think the notion of intention is like an artifact, like an anachronistic artifact of a political maneuver of Puritanism notwithstanding, that when you really think of intention, to me, it's kind of like a nonsensical notion. You know, what does one intend to do? I mean, in how many actions in your life can you actually recover your intention of that act? And then the notion of intention itself, it only comes in a kind of like juridical joust, right? Like a confrontation between a certain kind of power and the latching on to this like Christian notion of intention. But anyway, you know, Derrida kind of like carelessly and frivolously applies this notion to Descartes, right? And he says, oh, you know, in order to understand Descartes, it's absolutely essential that we understand what he meant and what he wanted to say. Whereas for Foucault, he's happy to say, well, I don't know. I don't know, you know, whether Foucault would agree or not, you know, blah, 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 it doesn't matter, intention, I don't care. You know, and I just can't get over this in his analysis. I can't take him seriously because it seems to me that his kind of, his attempt to assume this you know, this philosophical God, which is also, you know, mirrored in the kind of materiality of his life and existence. This attempt to like silence, to shut down, and to do so like virulently, but in a kind of like bourgeois way of self-effacement, where he's constantly like, you know, checking himself and controlling himself and always looking for the exit, you know, and I don't know, like the evil demonic genius is precisely Derrida, where, you know, he talks about a passage and then he says, oh, I will halt my reading of this passage at this point and resume it at this other one. And I mean, how does he give these two different standards to Descartes and to Foucault? Well, he gives these two different standards because Descartes has this significance within the French philosophical canon that lends science its power. And so Descartes, in a certain sense, is trying to like hijack this notion of scientific power that Descartes establishes and that Foucault is trying to dismantle and to disperse. And, you know, and to Foucault was always obsessed with these ideas of like, you know, heterotopias of showing how power is always based on a certain, like, you know, faiblesse, on weakness, on contingency. And Derrida is like kind of doing the absolutely opposite movement. And that's why I kind of like, you know, it's not to in any way dismiss the, like, the richness of Patrick's kind of reading and understanding. It's rather to articulate a limit or block within myself where all I see in Derrida is the movement, and it's like the you know, it's like being hypnotized by a fucking Bruce Lee film, you know, or you know, by the fight between like Morpheus and Neo in the Matrix, right? And Morpheus is the good master. Well, what does he do? He continuously reaffirms to Neo, which you know, if you think like there's acolyte, like neophyte, and I mean, you know, like acolyte and neophyte, the relationship between these words. Anyway, but you know, Morpheus continuously kind of like, you know, evokes like Neo to, you know, no, you can be faster, you can be stronger, you can break the rules more. Whereas Derrida in his confrontation, he seems to always be through the most like devious and modes of trickery, like the one I just said, where he poses a standard to Descartes, you know, where we absolutely have to engage with Descartes in this way. We absolutely have to understand his meaning and his intention. And then with Foucault, oh, I don't care. Oh, it doesn't matter, you know. Oh, it's okay, you know, it's you know, I do not know to what extent Foucault would agree. He doesn't give a fuck. And all the way through, he's making these maneuvers constantly. All the way through, he's doing this thing where he is kind of disavowing, or not necessarily disavowing, but he's taken an action which is fundamentally disingenuous and manipulative.
Luke,
You know,
can I go in there? Or
yeah. Sorry.
No. No, I mean, just to say, I mean, I totally agree. I'm not very acquainted with that, but for anyone who kind of wants more of what you were just talking about, there is the later reply, kind of, or not reply, but where he goes in and he says, I think the essay is called, or it's a lecture kind of a speech that he does called "To Do Justice to Freud," I think it is called. And I couldn't read it. I started reading it, and it was just so. I'm unfamiliar with that, but there is something, for me at least, a bit unsympathetic in how he writes.
Yeah.
It's just so dense with kind of self-confidence and uncertainty at the same time that I'm kind of like, oh, you know, like he.
Well,
right.
But he's a tease as well. He's an utter tease. Like he's like one of these like gold digger, like secret sluts. You know, gives you you're just about to leave, and he gives you a little bit of flesh. You know. No, but I think there's something kind of
for a long time, but
he talks for fucking like bores your head off, like, you know,
Yeah.
you think, well, maybe wisdom was said, but I wasn't awake for it, you know.
No, I don't listen. But let me.
No, Jakob, let me just.
Right, let him finish. Let him finish.
No. It's just like a POI, point of information, right? It's helping you along the way. Yeah. So what Foucault said of Derrida later is Foucault said that Derrida is a terroriste d'obscurantisme. He said he's a terrorist of obscurity. And so he said of Derrida, he said, you see, Derrida, what he does is he writes things that are so dense and so complex and so obscure that they are ununderstandable, right? And he kind of like wraps himself in these like pretzel-like knots. And then when you say to him, well, Derrida, can you be more clear? Could you, you know, like articulate this in you know, like a more lucid, or, you know, or a way that's like more systematized, or then he terrorizes you as like an idiot, as someone who can't understand him. You know? Right. And I just think that what you said in, you know, as trying to read like his like recurs to Freud, and there are all sorts of moments in here where he does exactly the same thing, and you can tell it's like this moment when his subjectivity shakes and he's trying to make a point, and then all of a sudden it's like when he makes this distinction between decision, dissension, and then all of a sudden he's bringing in like fucking concepts from German philosophy and all of this and and it's like this kind of impenetrable fog of notions and concepts that even to be able to engage, you would have to be a kind of like philosophical master. And then that's why I think Foucault is getting at with this, you know, the terrorist of obscripry and what you're bringing up with this to do justice with Freud. Yeah. Anyway, I'll shut up.
No, I just want to go in and shake things up a little bit, because to me, I'm you know, like when I read this thing, I'm like, okay, but Foucault obviously questions madness, right, and writes about it as a word, as a category. And we have we have several words in French. Now we have madness in English, right? But he goes through all of these things. Yet I feel I'm like, but why the fuck are they stuck with reason and madness, you know? And they are like doing this thing, and it seems as if, like, both for Descartes in his instance, but also in several ways where I just struggle, you know, because there are many passages kind of where they both refer back to Descartes, where I'm like, yeah, but what is this madness, you know, as a category? Like, what is it actually we're talking about? First of all, it's fucking imprecise. It's almost so imprecise that it's kind of irrelevant. Like, madness what? Like, are we talking about dementia, schizophrenia? What are we, psychosis? Are we talking about neurosis? What are we, like all the kind of vocabulary of today that I think at least is good in its way of specifying things, and we can argue about diagnostics and blah blah blah, but at least there is a certain specificity to say what is it that we're talking about here. But whereas with madness as a complete category, it's like, it makes sense to me in Foucault's treatment of it as a historical category. Some people are called mad, right? And then all of these things happen, and madness becomes this a power, or like all of what Foucault kind of does with the concept of madness, and shows how it's being used and so on. But when you use it here in a kind of, to me, it borders on not in the archive. Like now we're not in the archive anymore. Now we're talking about, okay, what is madness for Descartes, and what is madness as such, and all these kind of things. And here I'm starting to be like, yeah, why the fuck are you operating with this thing? I mean, I understand Foucault because the book is about it and it's related, but at some point I kind of cannot help to be like, yeah, but okay, so the dream and the madness, blah blah blah, all these things, like, do they actually work like this? I become a bit like this doctor that said that Foucault had no understanding of psychology or whatever. So I'm a bit like, bruvs, like, it doesn't work like this. Both for Derrida and Foucault, some of the stuff they say, I think Foucault I'm way more aligned with in how he talks about it. But yet again, he's often talking about a very specific kind of madness, or maybe madness is the umbrella, but if it is the umbrella, he's talking about something very specific here, like for example the idea that, or the things, Patrick, that you were talking about before, for example, that a mad person cannot kind of surveil themselves, for example. That they kind of are just doing this thing automatically and without kind of reflecting and catching themselves in the action, for example. I mean, without going into Freud again, of course, and his kind of model, I mean, it does match in a sense well with that, but it's a very strange notion of madness also, and what it means to be in madness.
I suppose
where I think Foucault kind of also has this other, or parallel to this, is of course history and autobiography, right? Where I think again, to me it seems like, without very clearly saying it, Foucault has this kind of close relationship to madness, again, as the lack of an earth, or, I mean, he spends a lot of time talking about the mad person's relationship to their own history, or again, like I feel he himself, without saying it maybe, but it seems to me that madness for him is very much categorized by a complete loss of identity, of history, of biography, etc. Then you are mad, Whereas I don't know, like, well, whatever, a lot of things, but just as an opening to talk about this thing, because I think at some point I'm a bit like, yeah, well, like, what are we talking about here?
No, I agree with you. Yeah, I think one only thing I say in response is, obviously there in the background of this dispute is the history of madness, which has established the concept of madness as it's being like included in this discussion. I do think the discussion massively exceeds that, but so the only thing I'd say there is that madness then is everything that's excluded or silenced in the name of reason, and then you go back to the archive to see what exactly that is, how the combat between something that's called reason, and something that's called madness, is, elapses, develops, is transposed into a whole variety of different forms. I was just thinking as well, where, like, you got this idea as well. This goes back to Luke's comment about mischief in Foucault, but I was thinking about, what's the title of the French one? L'histoire de la folie.
La folie intéressante.
Yeah. Huh?
Folie or folle intéressant?
No, it's
Histoire de la folie. Okay, well then you can see some kind of irony in that as well, because histoire in French is also the word for story. So you could hear that in that title, the old story of madness, that old story, the tale that we tell ourselves, almost like there's the fairy tale of the classical age, doesn't, to characterize the villain as a wolf, or an ogre, or a kind of Bluebeard character who locks up his wives as soon as they're married and slaughters them. The evil villain or the bogeyman of the classical era is the madman, you know. So it's that story we tell ourselves about madness. So then we do return to archives, but again, that doesn't take away anything from what you're saying. It actually, again, like if I were like to really try and take out my own hostility towards Derrida, is if words have no meaning in the text. Okay, and that for me is the ultimate like expression of like the violence of power. Like we see again in Netanyahu, in Trump, you know, your words have no meaning. There are no consequences that follow from the use of a certain word, you know, or like Humpty Dumpty. If you use a word in an odd sense, oh well, that's what it means for me. You know, may not mean that for you, but it's my word, you know, therefore I legislate as to what it means. And you do see there's a kind of linguistic decadence in Derrida's work. You've got this moment where he's celebrating something as demonic hyperbole, and that's supposed to be something that philosophy has access to. And it's epitomized in the moment where Descartes says, you know, you can go mad and still think, you know, that's demonic hyperbole. And that's given this kind of like sovereign value. Almost it's like a kind of a cosmic split, you know, that allows like a new epoch or a radically new thought to enter human civilization. And it's like a split or a little gateway over which the philosopher presides, you know. So it's kind of like illustrious, like almost like magical thing. And then he uses the demonic as a term of criticism to accuse Foucault of being a totalitarian, you know. So there's this sudden shift radical shift in the meaning of a word without any warning, without any like attempt to underwrite that or justify that or explain that. So words seem to be, on the one hand, used as kind of mirages or spells, you know, and on the other hand, to be used as curses, indictments, you know. And I think that happens with madness as well. You get to this point, and I think this is where your like vertigo comes from, because I also feel it, where it's like madness can just come to mean absolutely anything in this work. You know, dreams are madder than madness. How could madness have a meaning in that sentence? You know.
But to me, it's a bit shocking that why is it not defined? You know,
it's like saying that health is more toxic than toxicity. You know, like where do we how do we unravel that paradox? You know, the good is badder than the bad. Like
I mean, sure, if you define what is good and bad, sure.
Yeah, if you're playing, but I don't see the play, like the actual. So you've got this kind of like no holds barred licentiousness, and I've got like an interesting anecdote that typifies this. Deleuze was once asked in an interview about Wittgenstein, and his whole face dropped. He like held his head almost like a man in grief, and he says, "Assassin de la philosophie." You know, he's the murderer of philosophy. Okay, now who is Wittgenstein? Well, Wittgenstein is precisely someone who tries to reintroduce into philosophy the richness of everyday language. Like Luke was riffing on earlier, that logos means this here and this there, you know, and in this particular inflection or adjectival form has this other kind of like nuance and inflection. No. We obliterate ordinary usage, okay? We get rid of that, and what we do is we become custodians of a sort of like a more ethereal kind of language, you know. And the meaning of this ethereal language is only accessible or presided over or almost like commissioned by a kind of an elite set of thinkers. Maybe the philosophers, you know, but if we want to allow that word to be denigrated and trampled all over, but fundamentally excludes the ordinary man, you know, or the ordinary anything, like, you know. So now Wittgenstein's point was that, you know, in philosophy, words become empty. He said idle, you know, like a kind of, he imagined it as like a lever, you know, a man working in a factory, yeah, and he's been pulling this lever every single day for the whole of his life, you know, and on the day where he decides, you know, where he's about to retire, he's told that the lever is not actually connected to anything, and he's been coming in every day and pulling this lever with absolutely no effect on the overall working of the machinery, and he goes off and kills himself, you know, because it's so devastating. And this is interesting as well, that madness is the lack of a nerve, you know. He suddenly realizes that he lacks a nerve, that he's not been contributing towards anything, and he kills himself. And that is philosophy in Wittgenstein's critique. It doesn't have a nerve because the medium that it uses, language, it's hollowed out, it's eviscerated in advance, you know. It's kind of torn out of its element, which is life, like, you know, all the forms of life that constitute, embellish and refine or intensify or redeploy our use of this language, you know. and the variety of words. And Deleuze could turn around and say that, just shake his head, that, you know, Wittgenstein is the assassin of philosophy. Why is the assassin of philosophy? Well, you've got a kind of like situation here where these French philosophers are living in a kind of like Rome before it falls, you know. It's like philosophical decadence, you know. They kind of want to be able to get away with, as Deleuze puts it, buggering all the philosophers that have ever existed before and producing these kind of mutant babies. You know, that's what Deleuze says that the art of interpretation is. Now, I do like Deleuze as well, like, you know, but fundamentally he's part of this kind of like philosophical elite. And what's interesting, fit this in historically, is that, as again, this is like Luke's point, that there is actually a moment where Foucault's thinking becomes Wittgensteinian, you know, and he starts practicing this kind of like this art of Wittgensteinian grammar, like going back to ancient Greek texts and just tracking, you know, the kind of like the trajectories of a use of a particular word, like all the different deployments of the word paresia, you know, and all the different deployments of the word, like he translate. I never remember this epimeleia heitu or something, you know, care of the self. Yeah, care of the self, or souci de soi. Well, all the different ways in which this is used, you know. And for Deleuze, this is like, shit, but where does philosophy go now? Philosophy is the thing that just allowed to invent almost poetically its own meaning for logos and you know, care of the self and sovereignty and freedom and so on. But it's like, you know, their party has been raided by the peasants. The peasants have come with their pitchforks and says, no, it's our language. We want it back.
But you know, it's funny. It's funny. So I don't know. Like there's an ordinary everyday trace of this, right? So there's and I actually heard a young couple in England like talking about this, and it's the kind of like zero point of like banality of philosophy. Right? It's like, what is color? You know? If I see blue, do you see the same blue? And blah 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 blah. You know, blah, blah, blah. And what's funny is that it's that precise kind of like banality that Derrida tries to enthrone in and through this reading of Descartes, right? You know, so it's like, you know, painters cannot give you know, forms to unknown figures like sirens or satyrs. The you know, the forms are kind of like a medley of like dismembered animals, but certain real color does not remove even madness. But then I just think of like you know, there are these interesting colors that you know, you wouldn't say mustard yellow. It's just mustard. You don't say cherry red. It's just cherry. Now, in a dream, you would to bring this like dreaming aspect in. If in a dream, you know, you were to see mustard as blue, you would in some sense recognize that something was awry. You know, if next to your you know, your steak and your spinach and your boiled potatoes there was like a kind of, you know, indigo jus there, you know, you'd be like, what the fuck's going on? So it was like, oh, it's mustard. You know, like, fuck, you know, mustard's yellow. What's this fucking, you know, like yellow mustard going on? And I think it's kind of like interesting that he tries to situate. So he's desperately trying to situate this again, this imperious kind of like non-examined notion of logos that lacks inflection, that lacks even the most basic kind of Janus face. You know, like in the most basic sense, logos in ancient Greece means both speech and order, right? And the relationship between those two is like without all of the complexity of like inflection, you know, use, kind of you know, it's movement in like a game of discourse. But you know, he tries to rescue dreams from madness by saying, well, there is this absolute thing called color. Right, so the forms can be mixed up and and we can have medleys, but you know, color is something that's kind of like immediate, imminent. You know, like your apperception of color is always, but in fact it's not. And all it does is it kind of like doubles and reintroduces this distinction between like wakeful life and dreaming, right? Because in a dream it could be completely normal to have blue mustard, or to have like pink or to have like green ketchup. I mean, even maybe this form of madness is because I'm pretty sure that there has been a green ketchup.
Made out of green
just for
tomatoes.
like a kind of novel introduction of madness into waking life.
Yeah, I think this is actually a really good example, because what I'm thinking of now is that like test that Hume does, where he has all those colours lined up, or this whole spectrum of blue, but there's one sample of blue that's missing, and he says you can imagine that blue. Okay. Now, when Luke was talking, I was thinking, yeah, but as soon as I try to imagine mustard as blue, I do certain things to that blue to try and make it closer to mustard somehow. Like it becomes textured. It's a kind of dark blue, but that's kind of like for some weird reason, it's not a consistent blue. There are certain areas of the blue that are slightly darker than other areas of the blue, and I'm having to almost like inject it with other information from other senses. Like I'm giving it a tanginess. My mind's insisting on tasting this mustard, because I need to be able to access it as mustard. I need to be able to contemplate it as mustard. So you can see how even to be able to think of this like eccentric or extravagant, bizarre example, I'm actually mobilizing a whole series of other things that are not like part of this traditional reason. My ability to imagine taste. Again, the stuff that like the Descartes is excluding, my ability to taste, my ability to edit color, like and see, my ability to be able to like enter into an imaginative experiment. So that reason is not something that you can actually cut off from these other aspects or attributes of self, because even to be able to contemplate this philosophical example, I have to be able to taste, I have to be able to imagine, I have to be able to see, I have to be able to create. Anyway, I was just thinking about that. Like it's like there's this. In analytic philosophy, there's this thing called an argument from intuition, and it's the most abominable like form of argument, like ever. And what it involves is like coming up with these like really naff examples. Like, okay, there's a guy, there are two tracks, and you've got this train. It's a runaway train, and on one track there's one person, and on another track there are five people. Now the train is heading towards the track with five people. Would you grab the steering wheel and turn it onto the track with the one person just to kill the one person? And then the philosophers, the whole point in the argument from intuition is that the answer is a foregone conclusion. Okay, and the rest of the argument continues. The rest of the philosophical like argumentation continues as if you'd given the answer that they expect you to give. Oh, you turn the steering wheel and you kill the one guy. Therefore, like the utilitarian calculus does have a place in moral thought. Because the utilitarian calculus is all about like quantifying moral damage and moral benefit. Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah. Mm-hmm. But so the point is that the intuition is a fake imaginative experience. It's an imaginative experience that's utterly controlled in advance by a sort of imperious reason that knows the answer already, that doesn't give any space for you to imagine things, for you to be able to debate, resist, whereas like Luke's example of making mustard blue is like something from Lewis Carroll. It's precisely and merely a space of imagination, a space where you can go in and think, what is this possible? What can I do with this? What conclusions do I derive from it about color? About the relationship between color and texture. We don't know. We don't know where it's going to end. It's an example without limits that's supposed to provoke thought, not channel it towards a particular answer, as Descartes does, and as is done more generally in analytic philosophy, in this thing, argument from intuition. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm thinking about, not to spend our whole session here bashing Derrida, but I will give him an opening. So let's. I'll read a little bit of a text. I've already kind of prefaced it before, but I'll read it and then we can see. But this is essentially what I'm thinking of, where I'm like, okay, enough of this madness, reason, blah blah blah, Descartes, blah blah blah. We park that shit and we go into the master. So Derrida says, in writing A History of Madness, Foucault has attempted, and this is the greatest merit, but also the very feasibility of his book, to write a history of madness itself, of madness itself. That is, by letting madness speak for itself. Foucault wanted madness to be the subject of his book in every sense of the word. Its theme and its first-person narrator, its author, madness speaking about itself. Foucault wanted to write a history of madness itself. That is, madness speaking on the basis of its own experience and under its own authority, and not a history of madness described from within the language of reason, the language of psychiatry on madness. The agonistic and the rhetorical dimensions of the proposition on overlapping here. On madness already crushed beneath psychiatry, dominated, beaten to the ground, interned, that is to say, madness made into an object and exiled as the other of a language and a historical meaning which have been confused with logos itself. And here's a quote from Foucault. I think this is from the earlier preface. A history not of psychiatry, Foucault says, but of madness itself in its most vibrant state before being captured by knowledge. And then there is also some things that Derrida kind of puts in the same category, where Foucault, I don't have the quote here, but maybe one of you knows it, but where Foucault talks about a language without support, or a language, I think, without recourse, or something like this, is at least the way Derrida phrases it. And here I'm like, no, well, we can argue on things, I think, but we have touched upon this earlier, I think, with Foucault making this maneuver. I don't know, Luke, but what we talked about, it was from Foucault's text. I mean, a grand inquisitorial project, was it?
Parasitism.
Parasitism.
Yeah, parasitism. I'm wondering, Foucault changes his preface, which is from where Derrida has lifted a lot of this stuff, right? It's from the first 16.1 preface.
Mm-hmm.
So Foucault slashes that preface, writes a new one that is kind of an art piece in itself. And I don't feel he addresses, like in either the first reply or the My Body, This Paper, This Fire, he doesn't really in any way engages this criticism. He spends his whole time talking about Descartes and blah, 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 and blah, blah. But this, I'm like, has he faced this critique so much that he's a bit like, this is what everyone says, so I'm not going to engage here. This has already been a long debate. I'm not addressing this. Or why is it that he's completely evades this in Derrida's critique?
Well, I think it's so he talks about the remarkable criticism by Derrida, right? Like remarkable, and I mean, it'd be interesting to see what the actual the French is for like remarkable, but I think
So,
to me,
very sarcastic if it's remarkable.
It relates to this. Okay, so these two dimensions of Luke thinks Derrida is a cunt, right?
Yeah, but park that for a little bit.
No, because I'm bringing in the second dimension here, which is so if you think like logos, like basic bifurcation, right, is like is speech and then order, right? Now in a certain sense, if you imagine the combination of like speech and order is what forms this thing called language, or like language is at least like a presence or it's something that minimally haunts the logos, because the logos is very literally speech and it is very literally order. Like they are two very clear, direct, literal meanings that we can give to that word. Yet language in some way kind of brings those two together. And I think the reason why like Foucault doesn't engage with these things is because he just thinks that they're ludicrous. Like kind of in an ironic inversion, he maybe, or perhaps Foucault is like, well, what's the use in arguing with a madman? Like if someone has like such a kind of like childish notion of like logos, if someone is so almost like has like a Caligulan, or like a lust and desire for power like that of Alcibiades, Like, what effect could my mere and that's when, if you think of the 1972 preface, what is precisely what he puts into question? Well, it's the meaning and significance of the text. It's the meaning and significance of the word. Well, it's just an event, a minuscule thing that fits in your hand. And I think he's kind of, in a certain way, he's kind of like neutralizing this thing that Derrida does in that preface, because for him, in a sense, it's I don't know if you've ever talked to someone who's really mad. Right? So I remember having a conversation with a guy who was like a paranoid schizophrenic. In the kind of, well, he was diagnosed as such. I don't agree with diagnoses. I have this whole problem with people who live these diagnoses in and through the kind of like convergence of liberation from certain mechanisms of like power, social expectation that come with the diagnoses, right? So I find these things very problematic. But at the same time, that I engage with the person as they are. So I'm speaking to this guy, and what I noticed in this kind of speech with this guy was that it wasn't really like a discourse or an exchange or like a dialogue. Kind of like, in a different sense, I am like conscious and admit that I have this like caesura, this block, or like what Patrick describes as a vertigo that I can't get over. Like I can't get to the profundity of Derrida, because all I see are these, maneuvers. Like all I see is this cynicism. All I see is this kind of like deviousness and hypocrisy. And in some way, it kind of like prevents or limits me from engaging, which that might be a fault, and something for me to like think about, reflect on, turn back to the text. When I was speaking to, and this happened like, but in one time in particular, what I noticed was that what was going on in this thing, it wasn't a dialogue, it wasn't an exchange. What this person wanted to do was integrate me into their madness. Was for me to be a kind of triangulation or confirmation point that their experience was real. So if you imagine the doctors in that context are constantly, it is this constant state of like joust, confrontation, where through, it doesn't take the kind of archaic mechanisms of Pinel, of the shower, of the recitation of the day, of, but through other, perhaps more subtle, more, kind of medication-based ways of like numbing, of, I don't know how to say, but certainly there still remains in contemporary psychiatric practice this notion of the imposition of a certain kind of reality onto the patient. Right? So the patient in that context, well, they go into the psychiatric space with the doctors, and in that space, they're in this like combative mode. But then when they're, in the kind of like space outside of the hospital or a space with other patients, what they're always trying to do is to kind of integrate you into their madness, to confirm that their madness is real. So this guy, for example, you would walk into the courtyard and see him, and he'd be kind of like mumbling to himself in a certain way, which again, this kind of like murmur is something that like Derrida picks up here, right? So the guy would be like mumbling to himself, and then his mumbling was almost like a provocation. His mumbling was a provocation of a compassion, a provocation or test of others. So, when he mumbles, do they respond to my mumbling? Do they acknowledge my mumbling? Do they recognize me as a person who is in some kind of distress, who is distressed by, for him, the voices that tell him to do things? And then he would like elaborate this kind of like dual thing. It's difficult to describe, but on the one hand, there is this thing that more or less real, simulated or not. Let's just take it as it is, okay? Let's assume that he is hearing these voices, right? Let's assume that he is like, honest in his articulation, and his behaviors are honest in the sense of, they are spontaneous, natural. They're not volitionally or consciously simulated. And so the question for him that he repeated with many different people, it was always, firstly, am I recognized in my state of kind of like despair or anxiety, or am I recognized in hearing these voices? And then secondly, it would be an attempt to convince you that, well, it was like a kind of like a high wire act, because on the one hand he had the psychiatric power of the doctors that were telling him that these voices that were not real, and that we're trying to like medicate or therapize, therapize. Sorry, if it's not a word, it should be one. Therapize. Fuck it, I'm doing it. Like, therapize him into a state of agreement with their reality that was not his. And so, on the one hand, he obviously has this going on in his mind. On the other hand, he has this kind of question of like self, of other, of of all of these things. In fact, that Descartes invoked in his philosophical skepticism about the senses, about reality. So are these voices that speak to me real? Are the warnings that they give me real? Is the advice that they give me real? And so his constant attempt with patience was always, number one, this question of, and I'm not saying again, this is volitional. I'm taking it at a kind of surface phenomenological level.
Wait,
I'm not saying
can you
that,
just? I'm not understanding how this relates to Derrida's critique.
because like fundamentally what I think Derrida is trying to do through all sorts of devious, cynical means is to integrate the perception of the reader into his sense of the reality of Foucault's work, into the sovereignty and domination of his writing. Like, to me, when I read Derrida, I cannot stop at this question as whether or not anything that he is doing is honest at all, whether there is anything beyond mere maneuver. And that is the exact question that is posed to me when I speak to a paranoid schizophrenic, i.e., is this something that is real and spontaneous, or is this merely an attempt for him to confirm himself and the sovereignty of his thoughts? And let's not call them madness, because who knows, who knows if he had like a different sense or like a different intuition, or who knows if certain memories haunted him in a way that manifested. Who knows if this was actually a madness, right? But it was an attempt to kind of like use me as like a kind of third party to verify, to certify, to certificate him in his sense of himself. And I just can't get around that in Derrida. Like, everything that he says, I feel like that I'm just trying to be integrated into the reality of Derrida's reading, to the evisceration of Foucault. And then reading Derrida next to Foucault, so reading the Cogito and then reading like Madness or the Absence of an Oeuvre, the kind of like playfulness and joy of like Foucault, the uncertainty. I don't know. There's just something that's honest and true in Foucault, at least at the surface level, taken at face value, that I cannot get beyond suspicion in regards to Derrida. And the way that again, you were saying about reading this thing about Freud, he does exactly the same thing here. When he talks about this, and this is something that I think we should come back to, because it's something that we were talking about before, right? In regards to autonomy and capacity. Well, here in Derrida, this notion of decision becomes this really strong notion, and that kind of is exactly what I was playing on with my kind of inversion of autonomy and capacity, right? The autonomy and capacity are not these ideals to be decided, to be aspired to or moved towards. Rather, they are the premise, linchpin, or turning point upon which the decision to intern, to confine, to remove rights, to dehumanize, to drug, to all of the various humiliations that are characteristic of the hospital and internment. And it's precisely in that moment of like decision, and then he goes to like dissension, and then I'm like, what the fuck is this thing called dissension? And then he just starts like throwing in like bombs, like German words, and and it's like he's intentionally constructing this thing that I talked about last time, this fog of war. And so the relationship to Derrida between my conversations with paranoid schizophrenics is that I feel like fundamentally the same operation is going on. And so I can't get to the kind of like truth principle or the veracity principle or the philosophical principle, because I'm like stuck on this like borderline that I cannot cross, that in a certain sense, like, and maybe it's a fault, maybe it's something that I should reflect on, think about, return to the text again. But certainly, like at the moment, reading it's like a kind of like barrier for me, I just can't lend Derrida my mind, because in doing so, I feel like I'm being like hijacked. Like the only thing that Derrida is trying to do here is to take control of me, to take over me. to kind of, you know, to dominate my perception and my reading. And that to me is like an absolute constant, you know, throughout the piece. And you know, and if that is like a fault, flaw, or limitation that I need to reflect on and get over, so you know, to be able to see, okay, well, there is something profound here, there is like richness here, there is something going on. Well, you know, I'm open to that, but at the moment, it feels like I said, it feels like talking to a paranoid schizophrenic where all they want to do is to integrate me into the truth of their madness.
Yeah, because otherwise, what is the justification for this scattergun approach, these serpentine arguments, you know, the sudden, like, you know, bombardment with foreign words that you cannot be expected to understand, the dropping of a line of argument for no reason whatsoever, you know, with no rationale put to it? What is that contempt for the reader? Where's the philosophical justification for that kind of contempt? Now, what I notice with that mad people often do, and it actually does appear in Derrida again, but is that what they'll often do is strike a pose of wisdom, strike a tone of wisdom, say something that actually has a lot of sense to it, you know, even is quite profound, but utterly incongruous moment, you know, a moment where it's kind of like, you know, in some completely like barbaric, ruthless way, meant to just justify their own stance. So you'll be like, okay, well, let's look, I understand that you don't trust me for this reason, you know, so let's just go through like in a kind of sequence of thoughts, the evidence that's available to us to try and bring you back to reason, bring you back to reality. And they'll be like, well, you know that those methods of like evidence and rationality, you know, they've been brought into question. You know, there's kind of stuff here where you think, well, yeah, but that's not relevant to this particular circumstance in which we're trying to, you know, release you from a kind of like paranoia and bring you back to some sort of method that might help to ground you again. Did you know what I'm saying? Yeah. And so there is this critique of a certain kind of methodology which has its place, which in certain circumstances is wise and profound, but here it's been utilized, you know, in this kind of utilitarian way as a form of like a aggression or refusal of conversation again, you know, a way of entrenching oneself in madness. And like where I see that in Derrida is in these kind of preposterous, disproportionate demands that he places on Foucault's text. So precisely where he talks, Jakob, about the passage you mentioned, yeah, about this idea of how can you allow for the appearance of madness in itself, okay, when madness is fundamentally inarticulate, okay, how can you construct a kind of ordered form of madness when madness is fundamentally disordered and incoherent, you know? And Derrida starts like delving into the etymology of archaeology. Okay, so he takes Foucault's idea that he's like, I can't remember exactly what it is, but I'm not writing something like history of psychiatry or whatever it is. I'm writing an archaeology of silence. Okay, so he says, well, like look at this Greek word archaeology. Arche means kind of order, structure, but also means first origin. Okay, so he's aiming to get back to a particular origin and impose a kind of order or structure on it. But he's precisely trying to do this to something that resists and is impervious to order, structure, and language, and that's silence. Okay, and then he links it to this idea that basically, if madness is silence, then reason can be identified with language. But Foucault's book is written in language, you know. Therefore, how could it be this arena in which the voices of madness are allowed to talk? If it's fundamentally textual, linguistic, written in language, and madness is non-linguistic, it's murmurs and silence. Now, this seems like an insane standard to which you know to subject a text to. Like, how can you oblige a text not to use language? You know, it's like this is again a kind of Wittgensteinian critique. Like, you set up a standard for the use of a word that can never actually be met. Okay, therefore there are no conditions and circumstances in which you can now ever use this word. You know? And the same thing has come about. How could Foucault defend himself against that accusation? You know, that he hasn't articulated madness in itself because madness itself is silent. You know, that he hasn't articulated madness itself in and through an archaeology because madness itself is deranged and incoherent. You know, do you know what I'm saying? Yeah, you know? The standards are deliberately too high. So then you have to ask, well, how do we, you know, write an archaeology of that Derrida, you know, and his desire to make the standards ridiculously high, you know, and then we end up, well, close to Luke's idea. I don't know if I go that far, but you know, there's something about that, you know. Then you have to, who's going to come along and defend Derrida and say, oh no, it's really important that he's kind of tantalizing and teasing us, and he's dropping a German word so that we go and look it up and we get deeper into this kind of like philosophical issue, you know. And he's fundamentally proposing unanswerable problems, because the art of aporia is essential to the history of philosophy. Look at, you know, Plato and the aporetic dialogues that end in inconclusiveness and uncertainty. Derrida is doing a simpler thing here. But it seems this is again like the criminal, the lawyer for the gangster. You know, it's like, yeah, you can always rationalize. It's like I say to Oscar sometimes, like, he's a master rationalizer of everything, but it doesn't make you right. Like, just because you can justify, underwrite, and rationalize everything you do, you know, it doesn't make you right, because you know, how should I put it? The rationalizations become knee jerk. You know, they're actually ways of like shutting your ears to the other person. You know, they're actually a way of not being, you know, philosophical, which is to say open-minded, you know, thoughtful, receptive. So I do find that hard as well. What would you think, Jakob? Like,
no, but I think it's great. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I gave him too much slack and maybe inserted my own interpretation into it, actually. Okay. And what I was thinking was this kind of, at least I saw in it, and I think now that we've gone through it, I struggle as well to see it, I'm struggling to see what I originally thought. But I saw more this kind of parasitism of Foucault, you know, in the sense that, I mean, the very simple argument, I think that, okay, so when you kind of, in a sense, work with the archive and reproduce the archive in your text and these things, are you not solidifying the understanding of madness as a particular thing, in a sense, right? Or Foucault's, in a sense, parasitism of the archives, that, well, who decides here what we know, right? I mean, it's Foucault that you know, tells us the story of what madness is and has been, and etc., right? Which you know, it doesn't seem at all actually that is what Derrida is getting at. But I saw in it a kind of moment where, okay, are we going in here, kind of?
Okay, all right. Maybe the only way I'd try to like politicize this or set it within a kind of political context is to go back. Like, I had these two experiences recently. Like, I've been listening. When I was younger, I listened to lots of grime, but then I stopped for about like 8 years, and now, like, you know, I was listening to Getz again. You know, do you know Getz? Yeah, you don't know. He's this like. So I was thinking about in relation to this idea of hybris, because he had this astonishing voice. You know, it's like, and in his early works, you can sometimes hardly hear the words, but that's part of like the kind of illustriousness of his rap. Like, it's incredibly good, like inventive, and I was having this kind of, I was rhapsodizing, like doing a panegyric to my mate who's actually from a similar, like he grew up in Tottenham, you know. He's like he came over to England like when he was 10. He's from the Congo, you know, and we were both going into, because he loves Getz as well, and we were both going into him, we're like quoting lines and kind of like rhapsodizing over Getz, you know, and having this kind of like festival of appreciation. Yeah, I brought up the same thing in the context of a discussion with these kind of like bourgeois people, and then their attitude was completely different. It wasn't like, oh, I'm out of touch with that, I don't know what you're talking about. They actually question my right to be able to talk about Getz because I'm not from the ghetto. And that again, it's like that's another example of raising the bar incredibly high. So I cannot appreciate what grime music because I'm not from the ghetto. Whereas with someone who grew up in a similar area, like literally down the road from Getz, we can have this moment of like a partying moment, a moment of festivity and, you know, carnival appreciation, where we're rapping lines, investigating them, analyzing them, talking about, you know, his idiosyncrasy of voice. But you come into the context of someone who feels threatened by this art form, and immediately they set up this standard as a protective measure, you know, a defensive measure, and they say they strip me of the right, they disqualify me. And they say that I cannot talk about this because I do not have like the right social upbringing. Now, what is the point of that? Why did they perform that maneuver? Well, quite clearly, there's something behind them that they're protecting, you know. And I do think there's something going on like that with there's an analogy. This is an analogy. This is kind of an allegory of what's happening with Derrida. Derrida's trying to protect something behind him. We can imagine him in like this, you know, outside a citadel, and he's saying, no, Foucault, you can't bring your mad voices in here. You know. Anyway, what right do you have to be the spokesman of mad people? What right do you have to be the tribune of the mad here? You know. Do you see what I'm saying? So I don't have to actually receive your mad people into philosophy. It's all well and interesting at the level of reportage, at the level of history, you know, at the level of anecdote, but that's not the level of philosophy. Okay. If your concept of madness wants to get inside the citadel of philosophy, has to be different. You know, it can't be this thing that you know. Go on, sorry, this plethora of voices that.
But that, you know, kind of like two, you know, like an ordinary and a superlative. So, you know, the superlative would be that, you know, madness has always been, well, not always, but, you know, for centuries, for millennia, was associated with genius. You know, like this idea of as the artist as daemon. You know, this is why the great masters, they didn't sign their paintings, because their paintings, in a sense, weren't painted by them. They were possessed in some way by God, and they were you know, relays, no, transmitters of the divine will onto the canvas. You know, so to write one's name on a painting would have been obscene. And then there is, and it's not something that's like really brought up, but both of them kind of like touch on it from different ways. So that's like the you know, the superlative. But then the kind of ordinary is, you know, like I was just saying, is that in all of the forms of madness that I've ever experienced, they are always utterly reasonable. You know, they are so rarely these, you know, like kind of ecstatic or these, you know, these outbursts, these frenzies. I mean, to take like you know, examples like that maybe you know, familiar, like you know, the one I was just saying about, well, what was that person trying to do? You know, he wasn't screaming voices, he wasn't like shouting them out, he wasn't, you know, running around naked, you know, he wasn't. Fundamentally, his discourse was one of reason and reasonableness. You know, so there was absolutely not this bifurcation, this imperious logos, you know, of you know, kind of like truth, sovereignty, justice, blah 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 blah, which in some way, like you know, is the kind of like, you know, sneaky illusion that I think Derrida is making. No, like you know, the discourse of the schizophrenic is the discourse of reason, the discourse of, you know, like an example that maybe, you know, some of us might be more familiar with, of the, you know, of the anorexic. It's fundamentally a discourse of reason. Like, it's a very reasonable, like rational kind of way to like relate to one's body in the context of, I don't know, you know, like certain ideas of like control, and you know, the way that like these kind of behaviors, like you know, to use diagnoses that I don't like, but like OCD, for example, you know, well, when does that become more, I don't know, like prevalent or manifest? Well, it's precisely in scenarios of disorder. You know? So you know, in a scenario of disorder, one becomes more kind of obsessive compulsive about, you know, the imposition of their again, like, you know, I'm playing loose and fast here, but let's say like an internal like psychic reality onto an external reality. You know, this must be done in this way. This must be done in this way. This would, you know, that must be done in this way. There is this kind of order to things that you know, that cannot be disturbed. And so I don't know. Again, like the very premise of Derrida's critique of Foucault, I just find unfathomable. You know, like the idea that madness is some way foreign to reason, and whereas for me, madness is like eminently reasonable in most of its forms. You know, in most of its forms, madness is even, you know, the what Patrick said a minute ago. You know, there is kind of like reason there. There is this sense of oh well, you know, like you know, to lead you in a certain way, or to convince you, or to, you know, like, you know, madness is always of kind of like again, and I'm talking about, I'm talking majoritarianly here, like in the main, it is to me like fundamentally a discourse of reason. And it's also fundamentally something that's deeply involved with language, that's deeply involved with denotation and signs. I mean, just think of like paranoia, right? So, well, what is paranoia? Well, paranoia is where you falsely attribute a danger to a non threatening sign.
Mm.
But nonetheless, there is still reason there. It's just a reason that has kind of got out of hand in some way. A reason that is become promiscuous. I always give this example of where I grew up, for example. So say in Denmark, right? If where you live, Jakob, right? If someone was staying at your gaff, right, and they were like, oh, I want to go and get some, like a drink from 7-Eleven, but it's 1 a.m, like it might be a bit dangerous. It'd be like, mate, fucking just go to 7-Eleven, like it's Copenhagen, it's really safe. The odds of something happening from your door to the 7-Eleven by the metro station are like really fucking small. So it would be like a paranoid statement to make that. If you were where I grew up and you wanted to go after dark to the corner shop, people would be like, are you fucking insane? Are you absolutely mental? It's after dark because it's fucking dangerous, So paranoia would be, the person who takes like that sense of danger that comes from a particular place where the danger is real, and then there's a promiscuity of that danger to a different place. But still, it's fundamentally kind of like, I don't know. To me, it involves all of these things. Reason, logos, ratio. All of these things are involved and pertain to madness. And so, the idea that the in and through like lack or exclusion, which is what Derrida is trying to do. He's trying to, in some way, like absolutely exclude madness from the cogito and from the logos and from reason. And I think that's the exact opposite thing that Foucault is trying to do. And just to
we're trying to exclude the mad, I'd say. He wants to include madness, but only a madness that he performs. He wants to exclude the mad, that more unknown quantity, that perilous element.
But just just this passage from Foucault. Medical process might one day cause mental illness to disappear, like leprosy and tuberculosis. But that one thing will remain, which is the relationship between man and his fantasies, his impossible, his non-corporeal pain, his cancer of the night. That once the pathological is nullified, the obscure belonging of man, to madness, will be ageless memory of an ill whose form as sickness has been effaced, but which lives as obstinately as unhappiness. All that will be known in that we, Western men, live 5 centuries old, were in fact on the surface of the earth, those people who, among many other fundamental characteristics, had one that was stranger than all the others. We had a deep and pathos-filled relationship to mental illness, one that we ourselves found difficult to formulate, but which was impenetrable to anyone else, and which we experienced the most of all in the sense of danger, and that was perhaps our closest truth. And I just think that that's just such a sublime passage from Foucault. And again, like what I'd really like to do, in fact, is for me to like go and like actually like for once like systematize this devilish, devious character that I see in Derrida. Maybe in a way to like make like a, what are those things you call you jump over when you run?
Hurdles.
Yeah. To make him into a kind of hurdle such that I can leap over him. Because at the moment I just see this dispersion of tactics. And then when I read like that passage of Foucault, it just seems to me so sublime. And it brings in precisely this historicity. And that's why I think that Foucault doesn't engage with Derrida. He doesn't engage with this like methodological critique, because for Foucault to speak to him is like to speak to a madman. and is to be drawn into the kind of truth of someone who is mad, who is nothing but tactic and maneuver, who, you know, whose significance is only to kind of like draw you, to lure you in, to seduce you to a place that you do not want to be. You know, whereas Foucault is, you know, as he said in the kind of opening thing, he is, no, you know, I am not in that place where you think that I will be. I am over here laughing at you. Yeah.
Well, I think we ended there. I'm almost concussed now.
Yeah, I'm well tired. Yeah.
I've been just.
I mean, all right. Well, how about for, you know, like a slight change of tack? How about next week we do Kafka in the Penal Colony? Just because I think it's a great like little diversion.
Oh, it's cool. It sounds fun. Yeah.
You know, Inscription, the body, and then we do and then maybe like in that time, because of the, you know, the shortness of the reading of Kafka, we can all like more thoroughly absorb this you know, tete-a-tete between Foucault and Derrida, and, you know, return for the championship bout, you know, for the title, before finally, you know, go into the last two lectures of psychiatric power.
Cool. Or maybe we should come back to it after psychiatric power, or even like read History of Madness first.
Well, no, I don't know about that. I think that there was just like something really that I really wanted to get into with Jakob, especially this time, because of our previous, like, you know, kind of goings on about these notions, like, you know, autonomy, capacity, and I think there's something really rich about how Derrida takes this notion of the decision and characterizes this as like a heavy thing.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Well, let's do it. Why not? Yeah.
So I think I don't know, because I think that yeah, there's a lot of things to be said about these notions about autonomy, capacity, and I think this notion
I wouldn't mix them up with that. I mean, now I'm by the time now I'm like, oh, I'm a bit sick of this guy now. Oof. and I think, you know, like, there are much better ways of entering the kind of autonomy capacity thing than through Derrida. I think he doesn't make sense to me. Like, I mean, sure, but we could have maybe it might also be an ongoing thing, but I feel that there are way better entry points into that. But, well, I mean, we can also talk without.
Yeah, well, let's think about it then.
Yeah, but next week, Kafka in the Penal Colony.
Great.
You know, it'll be like a warm bath compared to this.
No, it's going to be fun.
Like a Moby Dick-esque torrent, you know, of storms. All right, nice one, guys.
All right, cool. Yeah, I'm basically invisible now, anyway.
All right.
See you next week.
Ciao.
See you later. Cool. See ya.